Chapter 11. Definitions. It may perhaps seem superfluous that I should add to my text a chapter dealing solely with definitions, but wide experience warns me that, in psychological work especially, one cannot proceed too cautiously when dealing with concepts and expressions, for nowhere do such lamentable conceptual divergences occur as in the province of psychology, creating only too frequently the most obstinate misunderstandings. This drawback is due not only to the fact that the science of psychology is still in its infancy, but there is also the difficulty that the material of experience, the object of scientific consideration, cannot be displayed in concrete form, as it were, to the eyes of the reader. The psychological investigator is always finding himself obliged to make use of extensive, and, in a sense, indirect, description for the presentation of the reality he has observed. Only insofar as elementary facts are accessible to number and measure can there be any question of a direct presentation. But how much of the actual psychology of man can be witnessed and observed as mensurable facts? Such facts do exist in the realm of psychology. Indeed, my association studies have, I think, demonstrated that highly complicated psychological phenomena are nonetheless accessible to methods of measure. But anyone who has probed more deeply into the nature of psychology, demanding something more of it than science in the wretchedly prescribed limits of a natural science method is able to yield, will also have realized that an experimental method will never succeed in doing justice to the nature of the human soul, nor will it ever trace even an approximately faithful picture of the complicated psychic phenomena. But when we leave the realm of mensurable facts, we are dependent upon concepts, which have now to assume the office of measure and number. That precision which exact measurements lend to the observed fact can be replaced only by the precision of the concept. Unfortunately, however, as is only too familiar to every investigator and worker in this field, current psychological concepts are involved in such uncertainty and ambiguity that mutual understanding is almost impossible. One has only to take the concept feeling, for instance, and attempt to visualize everything that this idea contains, to get some sort of notion of the variability and ambiguity of psychological concepts. Nevertheless, this concept does express something characteristic that is certainly inaccessible to rule and number, and yet conceivably existing. One cannot simply resign oneself, as Wundt does in his physiological psychology, to a mere denial of the validity of such facts as essential basic phenomena, whereby they are either replaced by elementary facts or again resolved into such. For by doing so, a primary element of psychology is entirely lost. In order to escape the drawback this overvaluation of the natural science method involves, one is obliged to have recourse to well-defined concepts. But before we could arrive at such concepts, the collaboration of many would be needed, i.e. the consensus gentium, or agreement of the people, so to speak, would have to be invoked. But since this is not within the immediate range of possibility, the individual pioneer must at least strive to give his concepts some fixity and precision, and this is best achieved by so elucidating the meaning of the concepts he employs as to put everyone in a position to see what he means by them. It is in response to this need that I now propose to discuss my principal psychological concepts in alphabetical order. And I must take this opportunity of requesting the reader to refer to these interpretations in every case of doubt. It must, of course, be understood that with these interpretations and definitions I merely wish to establish the sense in which I myself employ the concepts. Far be it from me to affirm that such an application is the only possible one under all circumstances, or even the absolutely correct interpretation. 1. Abstraction, as the word already implies, is the drawing out or isolation of a content, for example a meaning or general character, etc., from a connection containing other elements whose combination as a totality is something unique or individual, and therefore inaccessible to comparison. Singularity, uniqueness, and incomparability are obstacles to cognition. Hence, to the cognitive tendency, the remaining elements, though felt to be essentially bound up with the content, must appear irrelevant. Abstraction, therefore, is that form of mental activity which releases the essential content or fact from its connection with irrelevant elements. It distinguishes it from them, or, in other words, differentiates it. See differentiation. In its wider sense, everything is abstract that is separated from its connection with non-appertaining elements. Abstraction is an activity belonging to psychological functions in general. There is a thinking which abstracts, just as there is abstracting feeling, sensation, and intuition. See these concepts. Abstracting thinking brings into relief a content that is distinguished from other irrelevant elements by its intellectual, logical qualities. Abstracting feeling does the same with a content characterized by feeling. Similarly with sensation and intuition. Hence, not only are there abstract thoughts, but also abstract feelings, which latter are defined by Sully as intellectual, aesthetic, and moral. Narlovsky adds the religious feeling to these. Abstract feelings would, in my view, correspond with the higher or ideal feelings of Narlovsky. I put abstract feelings on the same line as abstract thoughts. Abstract sensation would be aesthetic, as distinguished from sensual sensation. See sensation. And abstract intuition would be symbolical as opposed to fantastical intuition. See fantasy and intuition. In this work, the concept of abstraction is linked up with the idea of the psychoenergic process involved in it. When I assume an abstracting attitude towards an object, I do not let the object affect me in its totality, but I distinguish a portion of it from its connections, at the same time excluding the irrelevant parts. My purpose is to rid myself of the object as a single and unique whole, and to extract only a portion of it. Awareness of the whole undoubtedly takes place, but I do not plunge myself into this awareness. My interest does not flow out into the totality, but withdraws itself from the object as a whole, bringing the abstracted portion into myself, that is, into my conceptual world, which is already prepared or constellated for the purpose of abstracting a part of the object. It is only by virtue of a subjective constellation of concepts that I possess the power of abstracting from the object. Interest I conceive as that energy equals libido, see libido, which I bestow upon the object as value, or which the object draws from me, even maybe against my will or unknown to myself. I visualize the abstracting process, therefore, as a withdrawal of libido from the object, or as a backflow of value from the object to a subjective, abstract content. Thus, for me, abstraction has the meaning of an energic depreciation of the object. In other words, abstraction can be expressed as an introverting libido movement. I call an attitude, see attitude, abstracting when it is both introverting and at the same time assimilates to already prepared abstract contents in the subject of a certain essential portion of the object. The more abstract a content, the more unrepresentable it is. I adhere to Kant's view, which maintains that a concept is the more abstract, the more it excludes the differences of things, in the sense that abstraction at its highest level is absolutely removed from the object, thereby attaining the extreme limit of unrepresentability. It is this abstraction which I term the idea, see idea. Conversely, an abstraction that still possesses representability or obviousness is a concrete, see concretism, concept. 2. Affect. By the term affect, we understand a state of feeling characterized by a perceptible bodily innervation on the one hand, and a peculiar disturbance of the ideational process on the other. I use emotion as synonymous with affect. I distinguish, in contrast to Bleuler, see affectivity, feeling from affect, in spite of the fact that no definition demarcation exists, since every feeling, after attaining a certain strength, releases physical innervations, thus becoming an affect. On practical grounds, however, it is advisable to discriminate affect from feeling, since feeling can be a disposable function, whereas affect is usually not so. Similarly, affect is clearly distinguished from feeling by quite perceptible physical innervations, while feeling for the most part lacks them, or their intensity is so slight that they can only be demonstrated by the finest instruments, as for example the psychogalvanic phenomenon. Affect becomes cumulative through the sensation of the physical innervations released by it. This perception gave rise to the James Lange theory of affect, which would make bodily innervations wholly responsible for affects. As opposed to this extreme view, I regard affect as a psychic feeling state on the one hand, and as a physiological innervation state on the other, each of which has a cumulative reciprocal effect upon the other. That is, a component of sensation is joined to the reinforced feeling, through which the affect is approximated more to sensation, see sensation, and differentiated essentially from the state of feeling. Pronounced affects, that is, affects accompanied by violent physical innervation, I do not assign to the province of feeling but to the realm of the sensation function, see function. 3. Affectivity is a concept coined by Bleuler. Affectivity designates and embraces not only the affects proper, but also the slight feelings or feeling tones of pain and pleasure. On the one hand, Bleuler distinguishes from affectivity all sensations and other bodily perceptions, and on the other such feelings as may be regarded as inner perception processes, for example the feeling of certainty or probability, or indistinct thoughts or discernments. 4. Anima, see soul. 5. Apperception is a psychic process by which a new content is articulated to similar, already existing contents in such a way as to be understood, apprehended, or clear. We discriminate active from passive apperception. The former is a process by which the subject of himself, from his own motives, consciously and attentively apprehends a new content and assimilates it to another content standing in readiness. The latter is a process in which a new content from without, through the senses, or from within, from the unconscious, presses through into consciousness, and to a certain extent compels attention and apprehension upon itself. In the former case, the accent of activity lies with the ego, in the latter with the obtruding new content. 6. Archaism. With this term I designate the ancient character of psychic contents and functions. By this I do not mean archaistic, that is, imitated antiquity, as exhibited for instance in the later Roman sculpture or the 19th century Gothic, but qualities which have the character of survival. All those psychological traits can be so described which essentially correspond with the qualities of primitive mentality. It is clear that archaism primarily clings to the fantasies of the unconscious, that is, to such products of unconscious fantasy activity as reach consciousness. The quality of the image is archaic when it possesses unmistakable mythological parallels. The analogy associations of unconscious fantasy are archaic, as is their symbolism, see symbol. The relation of identity with the object, see identity, or Participation Mystique, is archaic. Concretism of thought and feeling is archaic. Compulsion and inability for self-control, being carried away, are also archaic. That condition in which the psychological functions are fused or merged one into the other, see differentiation, is archaic. The fusion, for instance, of thinking with feeling, feeling with sensation, or feeling with intuition. Furthermore, the coalescence of parts of a function, audition coloriée, or synesthesia, ambitendency and ambivalency, Bleuler, that is the state of fusion with its counterpart, for example, positive with negative feeling, is also archaic. 7. Assimilation is the absorption or joining up of a new conscious content to already prepared subjective material, whereby the similarity of the new content with the waiting subjective material is specially emphasized, even to the prejudice of the independent quality of the new content. Fundamentally, assimilation is a process of apperception, see apperception, which, however, is distinguished from pure apperception by this element of adjustment to the subjective material. It is in this sense that Wundt says, this method of acquisition, namely assimilation, stands out most obviously in representations where the assimilating elements arise through reproduction, and the assimilated material through a direct sense impression. For then the elements of memory images are transferred, as it were, into the outer object, which is especially the case when the object and the reproduced elements differ so considerably from each other that the completed sense perception appears as an illusion, deceiving us as to the actual nature of things. I employ assimilation in a somewhat broader sense, namely as the adjustment of object to subject in general, and with it I contrast dissimilation, which represents the adjustment of subject to object, and a consequent estrangement of the subject from himself in favor of the object, whether it be an external object or a psychological or inner object, as for instance an idea. 8. Attitude, Einstellung. This concept is a relatively recent acquisition to psychology. It originated with Müller and Schumann, whereas Külper defines attitude as a predisposition of the sensory or motor centers to a definite stimulation or persistent impulse. Ebbinghaus conceives it in a wider sense as a phenomenon of exercise, introducing an air of the customary into the individual act which deviates from the customary. Our use of the concept proceeds from Ebbinghaus's conception of attitude. For us, attitude is a readiness of the psyche to act or to react in a certain direction. It is precisely for the psychology of complex psychic phenomena that the concept is so important, since it provides an expression for that peculiar psychological phenomenon wherein we find certain stimuli exercising a powerful effect on one occasion, while their effect is either weak or wholly absent on another. To have a certain attitude means to be ready for something definite, even though this definite something is unconscious, since having an attitude is synonymous with an a priori direction towards a definite thing, whether this be present in consciousness or not. The state of readiness which I conceive attitude to be always consists in the presence of a certain subjective constellation, a definite combination of psychic factors or contents which will either determine action in this or that definite direction, or will comprehend an external stimulus in this or that definite way. Active apperception is impossible without an attitude. An attitude always has an objective. This can be either conscious or unconscious, since in the act of apperceiving a new content, a prepared combination of contents unfailingly emphasizes those qualities or motives which appear to belong to the subjective content. Hence, a selection or judgment takes place which excludes the irrelevant. As to what is and what is not relevant is decided by the already orientated combination or constellation of contents. Whether the attitude's objective be conscious or unconscious is immaterial to its selective effect, since the choice is already given a priori through the attitude and therefore follows automatically. It is useful, however, to distinguish between conscious and unconscious, since the presence of two attitudes is extremely frequent, the one conscious and the other unconscious, which means to say that the conscious has a preparedness of contents different from that of the unconscious. This duality of attitude is particularly evident in neurosis. There is a certain kinship between the concept of attitude and the apperception concept of Wundt, though with this difference that the idea of apperception includes the process of relating the already prepared content to the new content to be apperceived, while the concept of attitude relates exclusively to the subjectively prepared content. Apperception is, as it were, the bridge which connects the already present and prepared content with the new content, the attitude being in a sense the end pier or abutment of the bridge upon the one bank, while the new content represents the abutment upon the other bank. Attitude signifies an expectation, and expectation always operates selectively. It gives direction. The presence of a strongly toned content in the field of consciousness forms, sometimes together with other contents, a certain constellation which is synonymous with a definite attitude, because such a conscious content favors the perception and apperception of everything similar and inhibits the dissimilar. It creates an attitude corresponding with it. This automatic phenomenon is an essential cause of the one-sidedness of conscious orientation. It would lead to a complete loss of equilibrium if there were no self-regulating, compensatory function in the psyche to correct the conscious attitude. Thus, in this sense, the duality of the attitude is a normal phenomenon, which plays a disturbing role only when conscious one-sidedness becomes excessive. As ordinary attention, the attitude can be either a relatively unimportant subsidiary phenomenon or a general principle determining the whole psyche. From disposition, environmental influence, education, general experience, or conviction, a constellation of contents may be habitually present, continually moulding a certain attitude which may operate even down to the most minute details of life. Every man who has a special sense of the unpleasant side of life will naturally have an attitude of constant readiness for the disagreeable. This excessive conscious attitude is counterbalanced by an unconscious attitude for pleasure. The oppressed individual has a conscious attitude that always anticipates oppression. He selects this factor in experience. Everywhere he scents it out, and in so doing his unconscious attitude makes for power and superiority. The total psychology of the individual, even in its various basic characters, is orientated by the nature of his habitual attitude. In spite of the fact that general psychological laws are operative in every individual, they cannot be said to be characteristic of the individual, since the nature of their operation varies completely in accordance with the nature of the general attitude. The general attitude is always a resultant of all the factors that can have an essential influence upon the psyche, such as inborn disposition, education, milieu influences, experience of life, insight, and convictions, gained through differentiation, collective ideas, etc. Without the absolutely fundamental importance of attitude, there would be no question of the existence of an individual psychology. But the general attitude affects such immense displacements of energy, and so modifies the relations between individual functions, that resultants are produced which frequently bring the validity of general psychological laws into question. In spite of the fact, for instance, that a certain measure of activity is held to be indispensable for the sexual function, both on physiological and psychological grounds, individuals certainly exist who, without injury to themselves, that is, without pathological phenomena, and without any demonstrable restriction of productive power, can, to a very great extent, dispense with it, while in other cases quite insignificant deprivations or disturbances in this region may involve very considerable general consequences. How potent individual differences can be is seen perhaps most clearly in questions of likes and dislikes. Here practically all rules go by the board. What is there, in the last resort, which has not, at one time, given man pleasure, while at another has caused him pain? Every instinct, every function can be subordinated to other instincts and functions and act as a servant. The ego or power instinct can make sexuality its serviceable subject, or sexuality make use of the ego. Thinking may overrun everything else, or feeling swallow up thinking and sensation, all in obedience to the attitude. Au fond, the attitude is an individual phenomenon and is inaccessible to the scientific method of approach. In actual experience, however, certain attitude types can be discriminated insofar as certain psychic functions can also be differentiated. When a function habitually predominates, a typical attitude is thereby produced. In accordance with the nature of the differentiated function, constellations of contents take place which create a corresponding attitude. Thus there exist a typical thinking, a feeling, a sensational, and an intuitive attitude. Besides these purely psychological attitude types, whose number might possibly be increased, there are also social types, namely those for whom a collective idea expresses the brand. They are characterized by the various isms. These collective attitudes are, at all events, very important in certain cases, even outweighing in significance the purely individual attitude. 9. Collective. All those psychic contents I term collective which are peculiar not to one individual, but to many, at the same time, that is, either to a society, a people, or to mankind in general. Such contents are the mystical collective ideas, représentation collective, of the primitive described by Lévi-Brühl. They include also the general concepts of right, the state, religion, science, etc., current among civilized men. It is not only concepts and ways of looking at things, however, which must be termed collective, but also feelings. Lévi-Brühl shows that for the primitives, collective ideas also represent collective feelings. By virtue of this collective feeling value, he also terms the représentation collective mystique, since these representations are not merely intellectual, but also emotional. With civilized peoples, collective feelings are also bound up with certain collective ideas, such, for example, as the idea of God, justice, fatherland, etc. The collective character does not merely cling to individual psychic elements, it also involves whole functions. Thus, for instance, thinking can have the character of a wholly collective function, insofar as it possesses a generally valid quality, when, for example, it agrees with the laws of logic. Feeling can also be a wholly collective function, insofar as it is identical with the general feeling, when, in other words, it corresponds with general expectations or with the general moral consciousness. In the same way, that sensation or manner of sensing and that intuition are collective, which are peculiar to a large group of men at the same time. The antithesis of collective is individual. 10. Compensation means a balancing or supplementing. This concept was actually introduced into the psychology of the neuroses by Adler. He understands by it a functional adjustment of the feeling of inferiority by a compensating psychological system comparable to the compensating development of organs in organic inferiority. Thus, Adler says, for these inferior organs and organ systems, the struggle with the outer world begins with the release from the maternal organism, a struggle which must necessarily break out and declare itself with greater violence than ever occurs in the more normally developed apparatus. At the same time, however, the fetal character provides an enhanced possibility for compensation and overcompensation, increases the capacity for adaptation to ordinary and extraordinary resistances, and ensures the formation of new and higher forms and achievements. The neurotic's inferiority feeling, which according to Adler corresponds etiologically with an organ inferiority, brings about an auxiliary construction, in other words, a compensation, which consists in the setting up of a fiction to balance the inferiority. The fiction, or fictitious guiding line, is a psychological system which seeks to convert the inferiority into a superiority. This conception gains significance in the undeniable existence, for we have all experienced it, of a compensating function in the sphere of psychological processes. It corresponds with a similar function in the physiological sphere, namely the self-regulation or self-direction of the living organism. Whereas Adler restricts his concept of compensation to a mere balancing of the feeling of inferiority, I conceive it as a general functional adjustment, an inherent self-regulation of the psychic apparatus. In this sense, I regard the activity of the unconscious as a compensation to the one-sidedness of the general attitude produced by the function of consciousness. Psychologists often compare consciousness to the eye. We speak of a visual field and of a focal point of consciousness. The nature of consciousness is aptly characterized by this simile. Only a few contents can attain the highest grade of consciousness at the same time, and only a limited number of contents can be held at the same time in the conscious field. The activity of the conscious is selective. Selection demands direction, but direction requires the exclusion of everything irrelevant. On occasion, therefore, a certain one-sidedness of the conscious orientation is inevitable. The contents that are excluded and inhibited by the chosen direction sink into the unconscious, where, by virtue of their effective existence, they form a definite counterweight against the conscious orientation. The strengthening of this counterposition keeps pace with the intensification of the conscious one-sidedness until, finally, a noticeable tension is produced. This tension involves a certain inhibition of the conscious activity, which can assuredly be broken down by increased conscious effort. But as time goes on, the tension becomes so acute that the inhibited unconscious contents begin to break through into consciousness in the form of dreams and spontaneous images. The more one-sided the conscious attitude, the more antithetic are the contents arising from the unconscious, so that we may speak of a real opposition between the conscious and the unconscious. In which case, compensation appears in the form of a contrasting function. Such a case is extreme. Compensation by the unconscious is, as a rule, not so much a contrast as a leveling up or supplementing of the conscious orientation. In dreams, for instance, the unconscious may supply all those contents which are constellated by the conscious situation, but which are inhibited by conscious selection, although a knowledge of them would be quite indispensable to a complete adaptation. In the normal condition, the compensation is unconscious. That is, it performs an unconscious regulation of conscious activity. In the neurotic state, the unconscious appears in such strong contrast to the conscious that compensation is disturbed. The aim of analytical therapy, therefore, is to make the unconscious contents conscious, in order that compensation may be re-established. 11. Concretism. By this term I understand a definite peculiarity of thought and feeling which represents the antithesis to abstraction. The actual meaning of concrete is grown together. A concretely thought concept is one that has grown together or coalesced with other concepts. Such a concept is not abstract, not isolated and independently thought, but always impure and related. It is not a differentiated concept, but is still embedded in the sense-conveyed material of perception. Concretistic thinking moves among exclusively concrete concepts and views. It is constantly related to sensation. Similarly, concretistic feeling is never free from sensuous relatedness. Primitive thinking and feeling are exclusively concretistic. They are always related to sensation. The thought of the primitive has no detached independence, but clings to the material phenomenon. The most he can do is to raise it to the level of analogy. Primitive feeling is always equally related to the material phenomenon. His thought and feeling depend upon sensation and are only faintly differentiated from it. Concretism, therefore, is an archaism. The magical influence of the fetish is not experienced as a subjective state of feeling, but sensed as a magical effect. This is the concretism of feeling. The primitive does not experience the idea of divinity as a subjective content, but the sacred tree is the habitat, nay, even the deity himself. This is concretism of thinking. With civilized man, concretism of thought consists in the inability to conceive of anything which differs from the immediately obvious external facts, or in the inability to discriminate subjective feeling from the sense-given object. Concretism is a concept which falls under the more general concept of Participation Mystique. Just as Participation Mystique represents a fusion of the individual with outer objects, so concretism represents a mixing up of thought and feeling with sensation. It is a state of concretism when the object of thinking and feeling is at the same time also an object of sensation. This coalescence prevents a differentiation of thought and feeling, anchoring both functions within the sphere of sensation, that is, sensuous relatedness. Accordingly, they can never be developed into pure functions, but must always remain the mere retainers of sensation. The result of this is a predominance of the factor of sensation in the psychological orientation. Concerning the importance of the factor of sensation, see sensation types. The disadvantage of concretism is the subjection of function to sensation. Because sensation is the perception of physiological stimuli, concretism either rivets the function to the sphere of sense or constantly leads it back there. The effect of this is a sensual subjection of the psychological functions, favoring the influence of external facts at the expense of individual psychic autonomy. From the standpoint of the recognition of facts, this orientation is of course valuable, but from the standpoint of the interpretation of facts and their relation to the individual, it is definitely prejudicial. Concretism produces a state where facts gain the paramount importance, thereby suppressing the individuality and its freedom in favor of the objective process. But since the individual is not only determined by physiological stimuli, but also by factors which may even be opposed to the external fact, concretism effects a projection of these inner factors into the outer fact, thus provoking an almost superstitious overvaluation of mere facts, as is precisely the case with the primitive. A good example of this is seen in Nietzsche, whose concretism of feeling resulted in an excessive valuation of diet. The materialism of Moleschott is a similar instance. Man is what he eats. An example of the superstitious overvaluation of facts is also provided by the hypostasizing of the concept of energy in the monism of Ostwald. 12. Consciousness. By consciousness, I understand the relatedness of psychic contents to the ego, see ego, insofar as they are sensed as such by the ego. Insofar as relations are not sensed as such by the ego, they are unconscious. Consciousness is the function or activity which maintains the relation of psychic contents with the ego. Consciousness is not identical with psyche since, in my view, psyche represents the totality of all the psychic contents, and these are not necessarily all bound up directly with the ego, that is, related to it in such a way that they take on the quality of consciousness. There exist a great many psychic complexes, and these are not all necessarily connected with the ego. 13. Constructive. This concept is used by me in an equivalent sense to synthetic, almost in fact as an illustration of the latter concept. Constructive means building up. I employ constructive and synthetic in describing a method that is opposed to the reductive. The constructive method is concerned with the elaboration of unconscious products, dreams, fantasies, etc. It takes the unconscious product as a basis or starting point, as a symbolical expression, which, stretching on ahead as it were, represents a coming phase of psychological development. In this connection, Meda actually speaks of a prospective function of the unconscious, which half playfully anticipates the future psychological development. Adler, too, recognizes an anticipatory function of the unconscious. It is obvious that the product of the unconscious must not be regarded as a finished thing, a sort of end product, for in this case it would be dispossessed of every practical significance. Even Freud allows the dream a teleological role as the guardian of sleep, although for him its prospective function is essentially restricted to wishes. The practical character of unconscious tendencies, however, cannot be disputed a priori if we are to accept the analogy with other psychological or physiological functions. We conceive the product of the unconscious, therefore, as an expression orientated to a goal or purpose, but characterizing the objective in symbolical metaphor. In accordance with this conception, the constructive method of interpretation is not so much concerned with the basic sources underlying the unconscious product, or with the mere raw materials as such, as it is with the aim to raise the symbolical product to a general and comprehensible expression. The free associations of the unconscious product are thus considered with a view to a psychological objective and not from the standpoint of derivation. They are viewed from the angle of future action or inaction. Their relation to the conscious situation is thereby scrupulously considered, for with the compensatory conception of the unconscious, its activity has an essentially supplementary significance for the conscious situation. Since it is now a question of an anticipatory orientation, the actual relation to the object does not loom so large as in the reductive procedure, which is preoccupied with the actual past relations with the object. It is much more a question of the subjective attitude, in which the object merely signifies a sign of the subjective tendencies. The aim of the constructive method, therefore, is the production of a meaning from the unconscious product, which is definitely related to the subject's future attitude. Since, as a rule, the unconscious has the power of shaping only symbolical expressions, the constructive method seeks to elucidate the symbolically expressed meaning in such a way that a correct indication is supplied to the conscious orientation, whereby the subject may discover that harmony with the unconscious which his future action requires. Thus, just as no psychological method of interpretation is based exclusively upon the association material of the analysant, the constructive method also makes use of certain comparative material. And just as the reductive interpretation employs parallels drawn from biological, physiological, literary, folklore, and other sources, the constructive treatment of the intellectual problem is dependent upon philosophical parallels, while the intuitive problem is referred to parallels in mythology and the history of religion. The constructive method is necessarily individualistic, since a future collective attitude is developed only through the individual. The reductive method is, on the contrary, collective, since it leads back from the individual case to general basic attitudes or facts. The constructive method can be directly applied also by the subject upon his own material. In this latter case, it is an intuitive method, devoted to the elucidation of the general meaning of an unconscious product. This elucidation succeeds through an associative, hence not actively apperceptive, articulation of wider material, which so enriches and deepens the symbolical expression of the unconscious that it eventually attains a degree of clarity through which it can become comprehensible to consciousness. Through this enriching of the symbolical expression, it becomes interwoven with more universal associations and is therewith assimilated. 14. Differentiation means the development of differences, the separation of parts from a whole. In this work I employ the concept chiefly in respect to psychological functions. So long as one function is still so merged with one or more of the other functions, as for example thinking with feeling, or feeling with sensation, etc., as to be quite unable to appear alone, it is an archaic state, and therefore undifferentiated. That is, it is not separated out as a special part from the whole having its own independent existence. An undifferentiated thinking is incapable of thinking apart from other functions. That is, it is constantly mixed up with sensations, feelings, or intuitions. Such thinking may, for instance, become blended with sensations and fantasies, as exemplified in the sexualization, Freud, of feeling and thinking in neurosis. The undifferentiated function is also commonly characterized by the qualities of ambivalency and ambitendency. That is, every positive brings with it an equally strong negative, whereby characteristic inhibitions spring up in the application of the undifferentiated function. Such a function suffers also from a fusing together of its individual parts. Thus, an undifferentiated faculty of sensation, for instance, is impaired through an amalgamation of the separate spheres of sensation, audition coloriée, and undifferentiated feeling through confounding hatred with love. Just so far as a function is wholly or mainly unconscious, is it also undifferentiated. That is, it is not only fused together in its parts, but also merged with other functions. Differentiation consists in the separation of the selected function from other functions, and in the separation of its individual parts from each other. Without differentiation, direction is impossible, since the direction of a function is dependent upon the isolation and exclusion of the irrelevant. Through fusion with what is irrelevant, direction becomes impossible. Only a differentiated function proves itself capable of direction. 15. Dissimilation. See Assimilation. 16. Ego. By ego I understand a complex of representations which constitutes the centrum of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a very high degree of continuity and identity. Hence I also speak of an ego complex. The ego complex is as much a content as it is a condition of consciousness, since a psychic element is conscious to me just insofar as it is related to my ego complex. But inasmuch as the ego is only the centrum of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Hence I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality. Hence it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. In unconscious fantasy, the self often appears as a superordinated or ideal personality, as Faust in relation to Goethe and Zarathustra to Nietzsche. In the effort of idealization, the archaic features of the self are represented as practically severed from the higher self, as in the figure of Mephisto with Goethe, or in that of Epimetheus with Spittler. In the Christian psychology, the severance is extreme in the figures of Christ and the devil, or Antichrist, while with Nietzsche, Zarathustra discovers his shadow in the ugliest man. 17. Emotion. See Affect. 18. Enantiodromia. Enantiodromia means a running counter to. In the philosophy of Heraclitus, this concept is used to designate the play of opposites in the course of events, namely the view which maintains that everything that exists goes over into its opposite. From the living comes death, and from the dead, life, from the young, old age, and from the old, youth, from waking, sleep, and from sleep, waking. The stream of creation and decay never stands still. Construction and destruction, destruction and construction. This is the norm which rules in every circle of natural life, from the smallest to the greatest. Just as the cosmos itself emerged from the primal fire, so must it return once more into the same, a double process running its measured course throughout vast periods, a drama eternally reenacted. This is the Enantiodromia of Heraclitus in the words of qualified interpreters. There are abundant sayings from the mouth of Heraclitus himself which express the same view. Thus he says, "Even nature herself striveth after the opposite, bringing harmony not from like things but from contrasts. When they are born, they prepare to live, and therewith to suffer death. For souls it is death to become water, for water death to become earth. From the earth cometh water, and from water soul. Everywhere mutual exchange, the all in exchange for fire, and fire in exchange for the all, just as gold for wares and wares for gold." In a psychological application of his principle, Heraclitus says, "Let ye never lack riches, O Ephesians, lest your depravity cometh to the light." I use the term enantiodromia to describe the emergence of the unconscious opposite, with particular relation to its chronological sequence. This characteristic phenomenon occurs almost universally wherever an extreme, one-sided tendency dominates the conscious life. For this involves the gradual development of an equally strong unconscious counterposition, which first becomes manifest in an inhibition of conscious activities and subsequently leads to an interruption of conscious direction. A good example of enantiodromia is seen in the psychology of Saul of Tarsus and his conversion to Christianity, as also in the story of the conversion of Raymond Lully. Footnote: Dr. Illuminatus, 1234 to 1315, who as a soldier was notorious for his debaucheries, but later entirely changed his way of life and became a crusader against the Moslems. End of footnote. In the Christ identification of the sick Nietzsche, with his deification and subsequent hatred of Wagner, in the transformation of Swedenborg from scholar into seer, etc. 19. Extraversion means an outward turning of the libido. With this concept I denote a manifest relatedness of subject to object in the sense of a positive movement of subjective interest towards the object. Everyone in the state of extraversion thinks, feels, and acts in relation to the object, and moreover in a direct and clearly observable fashion, so that no doubt can exist about his positive dependence upon the object. In a sense, therefore, extraversion is an outgoing transference of interest from the subject to the object. If it is an intellectual extraversion, the subject thinks himself into the object. If a feeling extraversion, then the subject feels himself into the object. The state of extraversion means a strong, if not exclusive, determination by the object. One should speak of an active extraversion when deliberately willed, and of a passive extraversion when the object compels it, that is, attracts the interest of the subject of its own accord, even against the latter's intention. Should the state of extraversion become habitual, the extroverted type, see type, appears. 20. Feeling, fühlen. I count feeling among the 4 basic psychological functions. I am unable to support the psychological school that regards feeling as a secondary phenomenon dependent upon presentations or sensations. But in company with Höfting, Wundt, Lehmann, Kühlper, Baldwin, and others, I regard it as an independent function sui generis, of its own kind or unique. Feeling is primarily a process that takes place between the ego and a given content, a process, moreover, that imparts to the content a definite value, in the sense of acceptance or rejection, like or dislike. But it can also appear, as it were, isolated in the form of mood, quite apart from the momentary contents of consciousness or momentary sensations. This latter process may be causally related to previous conscious contents, though not necessarily so, since, as psychopathology abundantly proves, it can take origin equally well from unconscious contents. But even the mood, whether it be regarded as a general or only a partial feeling, signifies a valuation, not, however, a valuation of one definite, individual, conscious content, but of the whole conscious situation at the moment, and once again with special reference to the question of acceptance or rejection. Feeling, therefore, is an entirely subjective process, which may be in every respect independent of external stimuli, although chiming in with every sensation. Even an indifferent sensation possesses a feeling tone, namely that of indifference, which again expresses a certain valuation. Hence, feeling is also a kind of judging, differing, however, from an intellectual judgment, in that it does not aim at establishing an intellectual connection, but is solely concerned with the setting up of a subjective criterion of acceptance or rejection. The valuation by feeling extends to every content of consciousness, of whatever kind it may be. When the intensity of feeling is increased, an affect results, which is a state of feeling accompanied by appreciable bodily innervations. Feeling is distinguished from affect by the fact that it gives rise to no perceptible physical innervations, that is, just as much or as little as the ordinary thinking process. Ordinary, simple feeling is concrete, that is, it is mixed up with other function elements, frequently with sensation, for instance. In this particular case, we might term it affective, or, as in this book, for instance, feeling sensation, by which a well-nigh inseparable blending of feeling with sensation elements is to be understood. This characteristic fusion is universally present where feeling is still an undifferentiated function, hence most evidently in the psyche of a neurotic with a differentiated thinking. Although feeling is an independent function in itself, it may lapse into a state of dependence upon another function, upon thinking, for instance, whereby a feeling is produced which is merely kept as an accompaniment to thinking and is not repressed from consciousness only insofar as it fits in with the intellectual associations. It is important to distinguish abstract feeling from ordinary concrete feeling. For just as the abstract concept, see thinking, does away with the differences of the things embraced in it, so abstract feeling, by being raised above the differences of the individual feeling values, establishes a mood or state of feeling which embraces and therewith abolishes the different individual values. Thus, just as thinking marshals the conscious contents under concepts, feeling arranges them according to their value. The more concrete the feeling, the more subjective and personal the value it confers. But the more abstract it is, the more general and objective is the value it bestows, just as a completely abstract concept no longer coincides with the individuality and peculiarity of things, only revealing their universality and indistinctness, so too the completely abstract feeling no longer coincides with the individual instant and its feeling quality, but only with the totality of all instants and their indistinctness. Accordingly, feeling, like thinking, is a rational function, since, as is shown by experience, Values in general are bestowed according to the laws of reason, just as concepts in general are framed after the laws of reason. Naturally, the essence of feeling is not characterized by the foregoing definitions. They only serve to convey its external manifestations. The conceptual capacity of the intellect proves incapable of formulating the real nature of feeling in abstract terms, since thinking belongs to a category quite incommensurable with feeling. In fact, no basic psychological function whatsoever can be completely expressed by any other one. This circumstance is responsible for the fact that no intellectual definition will ever be able to render the specific character of feeling in any adequate measure. The mere fact that feelings are classified adds nothing to the understanding of their nature, because even the most exact classification will be able to yield only that intellectually seizable content to which or with which feelings appear connected, but without thereby apprehending the specific nature of feeling. Thus, however many varying and intellectually seizable classes of contents there may be, just as many feelings can be differentiated without ever arriving at an exhaustive classification of feelings themselves, because beyond every possible class of contents accessible to the intellect, there still exist feelings which are beyond intellectual classification. The very idea of a classification is intellectual and therefore incommensurable with the nature of feeling. Hence, we must content ourselves with our attempts to define the limits of the concept. The nature of a feeling valuation may be compared with intellectual apperception as an apperception of value. An active and a passive feeling apperception can be distinguished. The passive feeling act is characterized by the fact that a content excites or attracts the feeling. It compels a feeling participation on the part of the subject. The active feeling act, on the contrary, confers value from the subject. It is a deliberate evaluation of contents in accordance with feeling and not in accordance with intellectual intention. Hence, active feeling is a directed function, an act of will, as, for instance, loving as opposed to being in love. This latter state would be undirected, passive feeling, as indeed the ordinary colloquial term suggests, since it describes the former as activity and the latter as a condition. Undirected feeling is feeling intuition. Thus, in the stricter sense, only the active, directed feeling should be termed rational. The passive is definitely irrational, since it establishes values without voluntary participation, occasionally even against the subject's intention. When the total attitude of the individual is orientated by the function of feeling, we speak of a feeling type. See type. 21. Feeling into, Einfühlung, is an introjection of the object into the ego. For the fuller description of the concept of feeling into, see text of Chapter 7. See also projection. 22. Function. By psychological function, I understand a certain form of psychic activity that remains theoretically the same under varying circumstances. From the energic standpoint, a function is a phenomenal form of libido, which theoretically remains constant, in much the same way as physical force can be considered as the form or momentary manifestation of physical energy. I distinguish 4 basic functions in all, 2 rational and 2 irrational, namely thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. I can give no a priori reason for selecting just these 4 as basic functions. I can only point to the fact that this conception has shaped itself out of many years' experience. I differentiate these functions from one another because they are neither mutually relatable nor mutually reducible. The principle of thinking, for instance, is absolutely different from the principle of feeling, and so forth. I make a capital distinction between this concept of function and fantasy activity, or reverie, because to my mind, fantasying is a peculiar form of activity which can manifest itself in all the 4 functions. In my view, both will and attention are entirely secondary psychic phenomena. 23. Idea. In this work, the concept of idea is sometimes used to designate a certain psychological element intimately connected with what I term image. The image may be either personal or impersonal in its origin. In the latter case, it is collective and is distinguished by mythological qualities. I then term it primordial image. When, on the contrary, it has no mythological character, that is, lacks the intuitive qualities and is merely collective, I speak of an idea. Accordingly, I employ the term idea as something which expresses the meaning of a primordial image that has been abstracted or detached from the concretism of the image. Insofar as the idea is an abstraction, it has the appearance of something derived or developed from elementary factors, a product of thinking. This is the sense, as something secondary and derived, in which it is regarded by Wundt and many others. Since, however, the idea is merely the formulated meaning of a primordial image, in which it was already symbolically represented, the essence of the idea is not merely derived or produced, but, considered psychologically, it has an a priori existence as a given possibility of thought connections in general. Hence, in accordance with its nature, not with its formulation, the idea is an a priori existing and determining psychological factor. In this sense, Plato sees the idea as a primordial image of things, while Kant defines it as the archetype of the use of the mind. Hence, it is a transcendent concept, which as such transcends the limit of experienceable things. It is a concept demanded by reason, whose object can never be met with in experience. Kant says, "For although we're bound to say of transcendent reasonable concepts they are only ideas, yet are we in no way justified in regarding them as superfluous and unreal. For although no object can be determined by them, nevertheless, fundamentally and unperceived, they can serve the mind as canons for its extended and harmonious use, whereby it discerns no object more acutely than it would according to its own concepts, yet is guided in this discernment in a better and broader approach. Not to mention the fact that they may, perhaps, bring about a transition from natural ideas to practical concepts, even providing moral ideas with a certain associative texture of the speculative findings of reason." End of quote. Schopenhauer says, "By idea I understand every definite and established grade of the objectification of will, insofar as it is a thing in itself, and therefore removed from multiplicity. Such grades, moreover, are related to individual things as their eternal forms or prototypes." End of quote. With Schopenhauer, however, the idea is plastic in character, because he conceives it wholly in the sense of what I describe as primordial image. It is, however, indiscernible to the individual, revealing itself only to the pure subject of cognition, which is raised above will and individuality. Hegel completely hypostasizes the idea and gives it the attribute of the only real existence. It is the concept, the reality of the concept, and the oneness of both. It is eternal generation. Laswitz regards the idea as a law indicating the direction in which our experience should develop. It is the most certain and supreme reality. With Cohen, the idea is the self-consciousness of the concept, the foundation of being. I do not wish to multiply further evidence to establish the primary nature of the idea. These quotations should sufficiently demonstrate that the idea is conceived also as a fundamental, a priori existent factor. It possesses this latter quality from its antecedent, the primordial symbolical image. Its secondary nature, of an abstract and derived identity, it receives from the rational elaboration to which the primordial image is subjected before it is made suitable for rational usage. Inasmuch as the primordial image is a constant autochtonic psychological factor repeating itself in all times and places, we might also in a certain sense say the same of the idea, although on account of its rational nature, it is much more subject to modification by rational elaboration, which in its turn is strongly influenced by time and circumstance. It is this rational elaboration which gives it formulations corresponding with the spirit of the time. A few philosophers, by virtue of its derivation from the primordial image, ascribe a transcendent quality to it. This does not really belong to the idea as I conceive it, but rather to the primordial image, about which a timeless quality clings, established as it is from all time as an integral and inherent constituent of the human mind. Its quality of independence is derived also from the primordial image which was never made and is constantly present, appearing so spontaneously in perception that we might also say it strives independently towards its own realization, since it is sensed by the mind as an actively determining power. Such a view, however, is not general, but presumably a question of attitude. See Chapter 7. The idea is a psychological factor which not only determines thought, but, in the form of a practical idea, also conditions feeling. As a general rule, however, I only employ the term idea either when I am speaking of the determination of thought in a thinking type, or when denoting the determination of feeling in a feeling type. On the other hand, it is terminologically correct to speak of determination by the primordial image, when we are dealing with an a priori determination of an undifferentiated function. The dual nature of the idea as something that is, at the same time, both primary and secondary, is responsible for the fact that the expression is occasionally used promiscuously with primordial image. For the introverted attitude, the idea is the primum movens. For the extroverted, it is a product. 24. Identification. This term connotes a psychological process in which the personality is either partially or totally dissimilated, see Assimilation, from itself. Identification is an estrangement of the subject from himself in favor of an object in which the subject is, to a certain extent, disguised. For example, identification with the father practically signifies an adoption of the ways and manners of the father, as though the son were the same as the father and not a separate individual. Identification is distinguished from imitation by the fact that identification is an unconscious imitation, whereas imitation is a conscious copying. Imitation is an indispensable expedient for the developing personality of youth. It has a beneficial effect, so long as it does not merely serve as a means of accommodation, thus hindering the development of a suitable individual method. Similarly, identification may be progressive insofar as the individual way is not yet available. But whenever a better individual possibility presents itself, identification manifests its pathological character by proving henceforth just as great a hindrance as before it was unwittingly supporting and beneficial. For now it has a dissociating influence, dividing the subject into two mutually estranged personalities. Identification is not always related to persons, but also to things, for instance a spiritual movement or a business, etc., and to psychological functions. In fact, the latter case is particularly important. Compare Chapter 2. Identification in such a case leads to the formation of a secondary character, whereby the individual is so identified with his most developed function that he is very largely or even wholly removed from his original character foundation, so that his real individuality goes into the unconscious. This is nearly always the rule with men who possess one differentiated function, It is in fact a necessary transitional stage on the way to individuation. Identification with the parents or nearest members of the family is a normal phenomenon insofar as it coincides with the a priori or pre-existing familial identity. In such a case, it is better not to speak of identification, but of identity, a term which corresponds with the actual matter of fact. For identification with members of the family is to be distinguished from identity by the fact that it is not given as an a priori fact, but arises secondarily only through the following process. As the individual is developing out of the original familial identity, his process of adaptation and development brings him upon an obstacle which cannot immediately be mastered. A damming up of libido accordingly takes place and gradually seeks a regressive outlet. The regression brings about a revivification of earlier states, among others the state of familial identity. The identification with the members of the family corresponds with this regressive revival of a state of identity which has actually almost been overcome. Every identification with persons takes place in this way. Identification has always a purpose, namely to obtain an advantage, push aside an obstacle, or solve a task after the manner of another individual. 25. Identity. I use the term identity in the case of a psychological equality. It is always an unconscious phenomenon, since a conscious equality would necessarily involve the consciousness of two similar things, hence immediately presupposing a separation of subject and object, whereby the phenomenon of identity would be already resolved. Psychological identity presupposes its unconsciousness. It is a characteristic of the primitive mentality, and is the actual basis of Participation Mystique, which in reality is merely a relic of the original psychological non-differentiation of subject and object, hence of primordial unconscious state. It is therefore a characteristic of the early infantile mental condition. Finally, it is also a characteristic of the unconscious content in adult civilized man, which insofar as it has not become a conscious content, remains permanently in the state of identity with objects. From an identity with the parents proceeds the identification with them. Similarly, the possibility of projection and introjection depends upon identity. Identity is primarily an unconscious equality with the object. It is neither an assumption of equality nor an identification, but an a priori equality which has never appeared as an object of consciousness. Upon identity is founded the naive presumption that the psychology of one man is the same as that of another, that the same motive is universally valid, that what is agreeable to me must also be obviously pleasurable for others, and that what is immoral to me must also be immoral for others, and so forth. This state of identity is responsible also for the almost universal desire to correct in others what most demands change in oneself. Upon identity rests the possibility of suggestion and psychic contamination. Identity appears with special distinctness in pathological cases, as for instance in paranoid delusions of influencing and persecution, where the patient's own subjective contents are presumed, as a matter of course, to proceed from others. But identity means also the possibility of a conscious collectivism and a conscious social attitude, which found their loftiest expression in the Christian ideal of brotherly love. 26. Image. When I speak of image in this book, I do not mean the psychic reflection of the external object, but a concept essentially derived from a poetic figure of speech, namely the fantasy image, a presentation which is only indirectly related to the perception of the external object. This image depends much more upon unconscious fantasy activity, and as the product of such activity it appears more or less abruptly in consciousness, somewhat in the nature of a vision or hallucination, but without possessing the pathological character of similar products occurring in a morbid clinical picture. The image has the psychological character of a fantasy presentation, and never the quasi-real character of hallucination. That is, it never takes the place of reality, and its character of inner image always distinguishes it from sensuous reality. As a rule, it lacks all projection into space, although in exceptional cases, it can also appear to a certain extent externalized. Such a mode of appearance must be termed archaic, when it is not primarily pathological, though in no way does this do away with its archaic character. Upon the primitive level, that is, in the mentality of the primitives, the inner image is easily projected into space as a visual or auditory hallucination, without being a pathological phenomenon. Although, as a rule, no reality value belongs to the image, its significance for the psychic life is often thereby enhanced. That is, a greater psychological value clings to it, representing an inner reality which occasionally far outweighs the physical importance of external reality. In such a case, the orientation of the individual is concerned less with adaptation to reality than with an adaptation to the inner claims. The inner image is a complex factor, compounded of the most varied material from the most varied sources. It is no conglomerate, however, but an integral product, with its own autonomous purpose. The image is a concentrated expression of the total psychic situation, not merely, nor even preeminently, of unconscious contents, pure and simple. It undoubtedly does express the contents of the unconscious, though not the whole of its contents in general, but merely those momentarily constellated. This constellation is the product of the specific activity of the unconscious on the one hand, and of the momentary conscious situation on the other. This always stimulates the activity of associated subliminal material, at the same time as it also inhibits the irrelevant. Accordingly, the image is equally an expression of the unconscious as of the conscious situation of the moment. The interpretation of its meaning, therefore, can proceed exclusively neither from the unconscious nor from the conscious, but only from their reciprocal relation. I term the image primordial when it possesses an archaic character. I speak of its archaic character when the image is in striking unison with familiar mythological motives. In this case, it expresses material primarily derived from the collective unconscious, while at the same time it indicates that the momentary conscious situation is influenced not so much from the side of the personal as from the collective. A personal image has neither archaic character nor collective significance, but expresses contents of the personal unconscious and a personally conditioned conscious situation. The primordial image, elsewhere also termed the archetype, is always collective. That is, it is at least common to entire nations or epochs. In all probability, the most important mythological motives are common to all times and races. I have in fact demonstrated a whole series of motives from Grecian mythology in the dreams and fantasies of thoroughbred Negroes suffering from mental disorders. The primordial image is a mnemic deposit, an imprint, engram, semon, which has arisen through a condensation of innumerable similar processes. It is primarily a precipitate or deposit, and therefore a typical basic form of a certain ever-recurring psychic experience. As a mythological motive, therefore, it is a constantly effective and continually recurring expression which is either awakened or appropriately formulated by certain psychic experiences. The primordial image, then, is the psychic expression of an anatomically and physiologically determined disposition. If one supports the view that a definite anatomical structure is the product of environmental conditions upon living matter, the primordial image, in its constant and universal distribution, corresponds with an equally universal and continuous external influence, which must therefore have the character of a natural law. In this way, the myth could be related to nature, as, for instance, the solar myths to the daily rising and setting of the sun, or to the equally obvious seasonal changes. But we should still be left with the question as to why the sun, for instance, with its obvious changes, should not appear frank and unveiled as a content of the myth. The fact that the sun, or the moon, or meteorological processes do at least appear allegorized, points, however, to an independent collaboration of the psyche, which in this case can be no mere product or imitation of environmental conditions. Then whence this capacity of the psyche to gain a standpoint outside sense perception? Whence its capacity for achieving something beyond or different from the verdict of the senses? We are forced to assume, therefore, that the given brain structure does not owe its particular nature merely to the effect of surrounding conditions, but also, and just as much, to the peculiar and autonomous quality of living matter, that is, to a fundamental law of life. The given constitution of the organism, therefore, is, on the one hand, a product of outer conditions, while on the other it is inherently determined by the nature of living matter. Accordingly, the primordial image is just as undoubtedly related to certain manifest, ever-renewing, and therefore constantly effective nature processes, as it is to certain inner determinants of the mental life and to life in general. The organism confronts light with a new formation, the I, and the psyche meets the process of nature with a symbolical image, which apprehends the nature process just as the eye catches the light. And in the same way as the eye bears witness to the peculiar and independent creative activity of living matter, the primordial image expresses the unique and unconditioned creative power of the mind. The primordial image, therefore, is a recapitulatory expression of the living process. It gives a coordinating meaning both to the sensuous and to the inner mental perceptions, which at first appear without either order or connection, thereby liberating psychic energy from its bondage to sheer, uncomprehended perception. But it also links up the energies, released through the perception of stimuli, to a definite meaning, which serves to guide action along the path which corresponds with this meaning. It loosens unavailable, dammed-up energy, since it always refers the mind to nature, transforming sheer natural instinct into mental forms. The primordial image is the preliminary stage of the idea, its maternal soil. By detaching from it that concretism which is peculiar and necessary to the primordial image, the reason develops the concept, that is, the idea, which, moreover, is distinguished from every other concept by the fact that it is not only given by experience, but is actually inferred as underlying all experience. The idea possesses this quality from the primordial image, which, as the expression of a specific cerebral structure, also imparts a definite form to every experience. The degree of psychological efficacy belonging to the primordial image is determined by the attitude of the individual. When the general attitude is introverted as a result of the withdrawal of libido from the outer object, a reinforcement of the inner object or idea naturally takes place. This produces a very intensive development of ideas along the line unconsciously traced out by the primordial image. In this way, the primordial image indirectly reaches the surface. The further course of intellectual development leads to the idea, which is merely the primordial image, at the stage of intellectual formulation. Only the development of the counterfunction can take the idea further. That is, when once the idea is apprehended intellectually, it strives to become effective in life. Hence it attracts feeling, which, however, in such a case is much less differentiated and therefore more concretistic than thinking. Thus the feeling is impure and, because undifferentiated, is still fused with the unconscious. Hence the individual is unable to reconcile feeling so constituted with the idea. In such a case, the primordial image, appearing in symbolic form in the inner field of vision, embraces, by virtue of its concrete nature, the feeling existing in an undifferentiated concrete state, but at the same time, by virtue of its intrinsic significance, it also embraces the idea, of which indeed it is the mother, thus reconciling idea with feeling. Hence the primordial image appears in the role of mediator, once again proving its redeeming efficacy, a power it has always possessed in the various religions. What Schopenhauer says of the idea, therefore, I would prefer to apply to the primordial image, since the idea, as I have elsewhere observed under idea, should not be regarded as something wholly and unconditionally a priori, but also as something derived and developed from antecedents. When, therefore, in the following excerpt I am quoting the words of Schopenhauer, I must ask the reader to replace the word idea in the text by primordial image. He will then be able to understand my meaning. The idea is never known by the individual as such, but only by the man who is exalted above all willing and above all individuality to the pure subject of knowledge. Thus, it is attainable only by the genius, or by the man who has achieved mainly through the works of genius an elevation of his pure gift of cognition into a temper akin to genius. It is therefore not absolutely but only conditionally communicable, since the idea, conceived and reproduced in an artistic creation, for instance, only appeals to every man according to his intellectual powers, etc. The idea is unity split up into multiplicity by virtue of the temporal and spatial form of our intuitive apprehension. The concept is like an inanimate vehicle, in which the thing one deposits lie side by side, but from which no more can be taken out than was put in. The idea, on the contrary, develops within the man who has embraced it conceptions which, in relation to its homonymous concept, are new. It is like a living, self-developing organism endowed with creative force, bringing forth something that was never put into it. End of quote. Schopenhauer clearly discerned that the idea, that is, the primordial image according to my definition, cannot be reached in the way that a concept or idea is established. Idea, according to Kant, corresponds with a concept derived from notions, but that there pertains to it an element quite foreign to the formulating reason, rather like Schopenhauer's temper akin to genius, which simply means a state of feeling. For one only reaches the primordial image from the idea because of the fact that the way leading to the idea is carried on over the summit of the idea into the counterfunction, feeling. The primordial image has advantage over the clarity of the idea in its vitality. It is a self-living organism endowed with creative force. For the primordial image is an inherited organization of psychic energy, a rooted system which is not only an expression of the energic process, but also a possibility for its operation. In a sense, it characterizes the way in which the energic process from earliest time has always run its unvarying course, while at the same time enabling a perpetual repetition of the law-determined course to take place. Since it provides just that character of apprehension or psychic grasp of situations which continually yields a further continuation of life, it is therefore the necessary counterpart of instinct, which is an appropriate form of action, also presupposing a grasp of the momentary situation that is both purposeful and suitable. This apprehension of the given situation is vouchsafed by the a priori existing image. It represents the practicable formula without which the apprehension of a new state of affairs would be impossible. 27. Individual, unique being. The psychological individual is characterized by its peculiar, and in certain respects, unique psychology. The peculiar character of the individual's psyche appears less in its elements than in its complex formations. The psychological individual, or individuality, has an a priori unconscious existence, but it exists consciously only insofar as a consciousness of its peculiar nature is present, that is, insofar as there exists a conscious distinctiveness from other individuals. The psychic individuality is also given a priori as a correlate of the physical individuality, although, as observed, it is at first unconscious. A conscious process of differentiation is required to bring the individuality to consciousness, that is, to raise it out of the state of identity with the object. The identity of the individuality with the object is synonymous with its unconsciousness. There is no psychological individual present if the individuality is unconscious, but merely a collective psychology of consciousness. In such a case, the unconscious individuality appears identical with the object, that is, projected upon the object. The object, in consequence, possesses too great a value and is too powerful, a determinant. 28. Individuality. By individuality I understand the peculiarity and singularity of the individual in every psychological respect. Everything is individual that is not collective. Everything, in fact, that pertains only to one and not to a larger group of individuals. Individuality can hardly be described as belonging to the psychological elements, but rather to their peculiar and unique grouping and combination. See individual. 29. Individuation. The concept of individuation plays no small role in our psychology. In general, it is the process of forming and specializing the individual nature. In particular, it is the development of the psychological individual as a differentiated being from the general collective psychology. Individuation, therefore, is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. Individuation is, to this extent, a natural necessity, inasmuch as its hindrance, by an extensive or actually exclusive levelling to collective standards, involves a definite injury to individual vital activity. But individuality, both physically and physiologically, is already given. Hence it also expresses itself psychologically. An essential check to the individuality, therefore, involves an artificial mutilation. It is at once clear that a social group consisting of deformed individuals cannot for long be a healthy and prosperous institution, since only that society which can preserve its internal union and its collective values, while at the same time granting the greatest possible freedom to the individual, has any prospect of enduring vitality. Since the individual is not only a single, separate being, but by his very existence also presupposes a collective relationship, the process of individuation must clearly lead to a more intensive and universal collective solidarity, and not to mere isolation. The psychological process of individuation is clearly bound up with the so-called transcendent function, since it alone can provide that individual line of development which would be quite unattainable upon the ways dictated by the collective norm. See symbol. Under no circumstances can individuation be the unique goal of psychological education. Before individuation can be taken for a goal, the educational aim of adaptation to the necessary minimum of collective standards must first be attained. A plant which is to be brought to the fullest possible unfolding of its particular character must first of all be able to grow in the soil wherein it is planted. Individuation always finds itself more or less in opposition to the collective norm, since it means a separation and differentiation from the general, and a building up of the particular. Not, however, a particularity especially sought, but one with an a priori foundation in the psyche. The opposition to the collective norm, however, is only apparent since, on closer examination, the individual standpoint is found to be differently orientated, but not antagonistic, to the collective norm. The individual way can never be actually opposed to the collective norm, because the opposite to the latter could only be a contrary norm. But the individual way is never a norm. A norm arises out of the totality of individual ways, and can have a right to existence and a beneficial effect only when individual ways, which from time to time have a need to orientate to a norm, are already in existence. A norm serves no purpose when it possesses absolute validity. An actual conflict with a collective norm takes place only when an individual way is raised to a norm, which moreover is the fundamental aim of extreme individualism. Such a purpose is, of course, pathological and entirely opposed to life. It has, accordingly, nothing to do with individuation, which, though certainly concerned with the individual bypath, precisely on that account also needs the norm for its orientation towards society, and for the vitally necessary solidarity of the individual with society. Hence, individuation leads to a natural appreciation of the collective norm, whereas to an exclusively collective orientation of life the norm becomes increasingly superfluous, whereupon real morality goes to pieces. The more completely a man's life is moulded and shaped by the collective norm, the greater is his individual immorality. Individuation is practically the same as the development of consciousness out of the original state of identity, see identity. Hence it signifies an extension of the sphere of consciousness, an enriching of the conscious psychological life. 30. Inferior function. This term is used to denote the function that remains in arrear in the process of differentiation. For experience shows that it is hardly possible, owing to the inclemency of general conditions, for anyone to bring all his psychological functions to simultaneous development. The very conditions of society enforce a man to apply himself first and foremost to the differentiation of that function with which he is either most gifted by nature, or which provides his most effective means for social success. Very infrequently, indeed as a general rule, a man identifies himself more or less completely with the most favoured, hence the most developed function. It is this circumstance which gives rise to psychological types. But as a consequence of such a one-sided process of development, one or more functions necessarily remain backward in development. Such functions, therefore, may be fittingly termed inferior, in the psychological though not in the psychopathological sense, since these retarded functions are in no way morbid but merely backward as compared with the more favoured function. As a rule, therefore, the inferior function normally remains conscious, although in neurosis it lapses either partially or principally into the unconscious. For inasmuch as too great a share of the libido is intercepted by the favoured function, the inferior function undergoes a regressive development, that is, it returns to its earlier archaic state, therewith becoming incompatible with the conscious and favoured function. When a function that should normally be conscious relapses into the unconscious, the specific energy adhering to this function is also delivered over to the unconscious. A natural function, such as feeling, possesses its own inherent energy. It is a definitely organized living system, which under no circumstances can be wholly robbed of its energy. Through the unconscious condition of the inferior function, its energy remainder is transferred into the unconscious, whereupon the unconscious becomes unnaturally activated. The result of such activity is a production of fantasy at a level corresponding with the archaic, submerged condition to which the inferior function has now sunk. Hence, an analytical release of such a function from the unconscious can take place only by retrieving those same unconscious fantasy images which have come to life through the activation of the unconscious function. The process of making such fantasies conscious also brings the inferior function to consciousness. thus providing it with a new possibility of development. 31. Instinct. When I speak of instinct, whether in this work or elsewhere, I therewith denote what is commonly understood by this word, namely an impulsion towards certain activities. The impulsion can proceed from an outer or an inner stimulus, which releases the instinctive mechanism either psychically or through organic routes which lie outside the sphere of psychic causality. Every psychic phenomenon is instinctive, which proceeds from no cause postulated by the will, but from dynamic impulsion, irrespective of whether such impulsion has its origin directly in organic, therefore extra-psychic sources, or is essentially conditioned by the energies whose actual release is effected by the purpose of the will, with the qualification in the latter case that the resulting product exceeds the effect intended by the will. According to my view, all those psychic processes over whose energies the conscious has no disposal come within the concept of instinct. Thus, according to this view, affects belong to the instinctive processes just as much as to the processes of feeling. Psychic processes, which under ordinary circumstances are functions of the will, thus entirely subject to conscious control, can in abnormal cases become instinctive processes through a linking up with unconscious energy. This phenomenon always occurs whenever the conscious sphere is restricted either by repressions of incompatible contents, or where, as a result of fatigue, intoxication, or pathological cerebral processes in general, an abaissement du niveau mental, Janet, or lowering of mental activity, takes place, where, in a word, the conscious either does not yet control or no longer commands the most strongly toned processes. Those processes which were once conscious in an individual but which have gradually become automatized, I might term automatic instead of instinctive processes. Normally they do not even behave as instincts, since under normal circumstances they never appear as impulsions. They do that only when they receive a tributary of energy which is foreign to them. 32. Intellect. I call directed thinking intellect. 33. Introjection. This term was introduced by Avenarius to correspond with projection. The transveying, therewith intended, of a subjective content into an object is, however, just as well expressed by the concept of projection. It would therefore be as well to retain the term projection for this process. Ferenczi has now defined the concept of introjection as the opposite of projection, namely as an indrawing of the object within the subjective circle of interest, while projection means a translation of subjective contents into the object. Whereas the paranoic expels from his ego emotions which have become disagreeable, the neurotic helps himself to as large a portion of the outer world as his ego can ingest, and makes this an object of unconscious fantasies. The former mechanism is projection, the latter introjection. Introjection is a sort of diluting process, an expansion of the circle of interest. According to Ferenczi, introjection is also a normal process. Psychologically, therefore, it is a process of assimilation, while projection is a process of dissimilation. Introjection signifies an adjustment of the object to the subject, while projection involves a discrimination of the object from the subject, by means of a subjective content transveyed into the object. Introjection is an extraverting process, since for this adjustment to the object a feeling into or possession of the object is necessary. A passive and an active introjection may be discriminated. To the former belong the transference processes in the treatment of the neuroses, and in general all cases in which the object exercises an unconditional attraction upon the subject, while feeling into, regarded as a process of adaptation, should belong to the latter form. 34. introversion means a turning inwards of the libido, whereby a negative relation of subject to object is expressed. Interest does not move towards the object, but recedes towards the subject. Everyone whose attitude is introverted thinks, feels, and acts in a way that clearly demonstrates that the subject is the chief factor of motivation, while the object at most receives only a secondary value. Introversion may possess either a more intellectual or more emotional character, just as it can be characterized by either intuition or sensation. Introversion is active, when the subject wills a certain seclusion in face of the object. It is passive, when the subject is unable to restore again to the object the libido which is streaming back from it. When introversion is habitual, one speaks of an introverted type. See type. 35. Intuition, from intuere, to look into or upon, is, according to my view, a basic psychological function. See function. It is that psychological function which transmits perceptions in an unconscious way. Everything, whether outer or inner objects or their associations, can be the object of this perception. Intuition has this peculiar quality. It is neither sensation, nor feeling, nor intellectual conclusion, although it may appear in any of these forms. Through intuition, any one content is presented as a complete whole, without our being able to explain or discover in what way this content has been arrived at. Intuition is a kind of instinctive apprehension, irrespective of the nature of its contents. Like sensation, it is an irrational, perceptive function. Its contents, like those of sensation, have the character of being given, in contrast to the derived or deduced character of feeling and thinking contents. Intuitive cognition, therefore, possesses an intrinsic character of certainty and conviction, which enabled Spinoza to uphold the scientia intuitiva, or intuitive knowledge, as the highest form of cognition. Intuition has this quality in common with sensation, whose physical foundation is the ground and origin of its certitude. In the same way, the certainty of intuition depends upon a definite psychic matter of fact, of whose origin and state of readiness, however, the subject was quite unconscious. Intuition appears either in a subjective or an objective form. The former is a perception of unconscious psychic facts, whose origin is essentially subjective. The latter is a perception of facts which depend upon subliminal perceptions of the object, and upon the thoughts and feelings occasioned thereby. Concrete and abstract forms of intuition may be distinguished according to the degree of participation on the part of sensation. Concrete intuition carries perceptions which are concerned with the actuality of things, while abstract intuition transmits the perceptions of ideational associations. Concrete intuition is a reactive process, since it follows directly from the given circumstances, whereas abstract intuition, like abstract sensation, necessitates a certain element of direction, an act of will, or a purpose. In common with sensation, intuition is a characteristic of infantile and primitive psychology. As against the strength and sudden appearance of sense impression, it transmits the perception of mythological images, the precursors of ideas. Intuition maintains a compensatory function to sensation, and, like sensation, it is the maternal soil from which thinking and feeling are developed in the form of rational functions. Intuition is an irrational function, notwithstanding the fact that many intuitions may subsequently be split up into their component elements, whereby their origin and appearance can also be made to harmonize with the laws of reason. Everyone whose general attitude is orientated by the principle of intuition, that is, perception by way of the unconscious, belongs to the intuitive type. See type. According to the manner in which intuition is employed, whether directed within in the service of cognition and inner perception, or without in the service of action and accomplishment, the introverted and extroverted intuitive types can be differentiated. In abnormal cases, a well-marked coalescence with, and an equally great determination by, the contents of the collective unconscious declares itself. This may give the intuitive type an extremely irrational and unintelligible appearance. 36. Irrational. As I make use of this term, it does not denote something contrary to reason, but something outside the province of reason, whose essence, therefore, is not established by reason. Elementary facts belong to this category, for example, that the Earth has a moon, that chlorine is an element, that the greatest density of water is to be found at 4.0 centigrade. An accident is also irrational in spite of the fact that it may sustain a subsequent rational explanation. The irrational is a factor of existence which may certainly be pushed back indefinitely by an increasingly elaborate and complicated rational explanation, but in so doing the explanation finally becomes so extravagant and overdone that it passes comprehension, thus reaching the limits of rational thought long before it can ever span the whole world with the laws of reason. A completely rational explanation of an actually existing object, not one that is merely postulated, is a utopian ideal. Only an object that has been postulated can also be completely explained on rational grounds, since it has never contained anything beyond what was postulated by rational thinking. Empirical science also postulates rationally limited objects, since its deliberate exclusion of the accidental allows no consideration of the real object as a whole. Hence, empirical observation is always limited to that same portion of the object which has been selected for rational consideration. Thus, both thinking and feeling as directed functions are rational. When these functions are concerned not with a rationally determined choice of objects, or with the qualities and relations of objects, but with the incidental perceptions which the real object never lacks, they at once lose the quality of direction, and therewith something of their rational character, because they accept the accidental. They begin to be irrational. That thinking or feeling which is directed according to accidental perceptions, and is therefore irrational, is either intuitive or sensational. Both intuition and sensation are psychological functions, which achieve their functional fulfillment in the absolute perception of occurrences in general. Hence, in accordance with their nature, their attitude must be set towards every possibility and what is absolutely accidental. They must therefore entirely forego rational direction. Accordingly, I term them irrational functions, in contrast to thinking and feeling, which reach perfection only when in complete accord with the laws of reason. Although the irrational, as such, can never become the object of a science, nevertheless, for a practical psychology, it is of the greatest importance that the irrational factor should be correctly appraised. For practical psychology stirs up many problems that altogether elude the rational solution, and can be settled only irrationally. That is, they can be solved only in a way that has no correspondence with the laws of reason. An exclusive presumption or expectation that for every conflict there must also exist a possibility of rational adjustment may well prove an insurmountable obstacle to a real solution of an irrational character. See rational. 37. Libido. In my view, this concept is synonymous with psychic energy. Psychic energy is the intensity of the psychic process, its psychological value. By this I do not mean to imply any imparted value, whether moral, aesthetic, or intellectual. The psychological value is simply conditioned by its determining power, which is manifested in definite psychic operations, effects. Neither do I understand libido as a psychic force, a misunderstanding that has led many critics astray. I do not hypostasize the concept of energy, but employ it as a concept denoting intensity or value. The question as to whether or no a specific psychic force exists has nothing to do with the concept of libido. Frequently I employ the expression libido promiscuously with energy. My justification for calling psychic energy libido has been fully gone into in the works referred to in the footnote. 38. The objective plane. When I speak of interpretation upon the objective plane, I'm referring to that view of a dream or fantasy by which the persons or conditions appearing therein are referred to objectively real persons or conditions, whereas I speak of the subjective plane when the persons and conditions appearing in a dream are referred exclusively to subjective elements. The Freudian view of the dream moves almost exclusively upon the objective level, inasmuch as dream wishes are interpreted as referring to real objects, or are related to sexual processes which fall within the physiological and therefore extra-psychological sphere. 39. Orientation. This term is used to denote the general principle of an attitude. Every attitude is orientated by a certain point of view, no matter whether that point of view be conscious or unconscious. A so-called power attitude is orientated by the viewpoint of ego power exerted against oppressive influences and conditions. A thinking attitude is orientated by the principle of logic as its supreme law. A sensational attitude by the sensuous perception of given facts. 40. Participation Mystique. This term originates with Lévi-Bruhl. It connotes a peculiar kind of psychological connection with the object wherein the subject is unable to differentiate himself clearly from the object, to which he is bound by an immediate relation that can only be described as partial identity. This identity is based upon an a priori oneness of subject and object. Participation mystique, therefore, is a vestigial remainder of this primordial condition. It does not apply to the whole subject-object relation, but only to certain cases in which the phenomenon of this peculiar relatedness appears. It is, of course, a phenomenon that is best observed among the primitives, but it occurs not at all infrequently among civilized men, although not with the same range of intensity. Among civilized peoples it usually happens between persons, and only seldom between a person and thing. In the former case it is a so-called state of transference, in which the object, as a general rule, obtains a sort of magical, that is, unconditional influence over the subject. In the latter case it is a question of a similar influence on the part of a thing, or else a kind of identification with a thing or the idea of a thing. 41. Fantasy. By fantasy I understand two different things, namely 1. Phantasm, and 2. Imaginative activity. In my writings the context always shows which of these meanings is intended. When the term is used to denote phantasm, it represents a complex that is distinguished from other complexes by the fact that it corresponds with no actual external state of affairs. Although a phantasm may originally be based upon the memory images of actual experiences, its content corresponds with no external reality. It is merely the output of the creative psychic activity, a manifestation or product of the combination of psychic elements. Insofar as psychic energy can be submitted to voluntary direction, fantasy may also be consciously and deliberately produced, as a whole or at least in part. In the former case it is merely a combination of conscious elements, but such a case is only an artificial experiment of purely theoretical importance. In actual everyday psychological experience, fantasy is either released by an expectant, intuitive attitude or appears as an involuntary eruption of unconscious contents into consciousness. We must differentiate between active and passive fantasy. Active fantasies are called forth by intuition, that is, by an attitude directed to the perception of unconscious contents, in which the libido immediately invests all the elements emerging from the unconscious and by means of association with parallel material brings them to definition and plastic form. Passive fantasies, without any antecedent or accompanying intuitive attitude, appear from the outset in plastic form in the presence of a wholly passive attitude on the part of the cognizing subject. Such fantasies belong to the category of psychic automatisme, Janet. Naturally, these latter can occur only as the result of a relative dissociation of the psyche, since their occurrence presupposes the withdrawal of an essential sum of energy from conscious control, with the corresponding activation of unconscious material. Thus, the vision of Saul presupposes an unconscious acceptance of Christianity, though the fact had escaped his conscious insight. It is probable that passive fantasy always springs from an unconscious process antithetically related to consciousness, but one which assembles approximately the same amount of energy as the conscious attitude, whence also its capacity for breaking through the latter's resistance. Active fantasy, on the contrary, owes its existence not merely to a one-sided, intensive, and antithetic unconscious process, but just as much to the propensity of the conscious attitude for taking up the indications or fragments of relatively lightly toned unconscious associations, and developing them into complete plasticity by association with parallel elements. In the case of active fantasy, then, it is not necessarily a question of a dissociated psychic state, but rather of a positive participation of consciousness. Whereas the passive form of fantasy not infrequently bears the stamp of morbidity or at least some trace of abnormality, active fantasy belongs to the highest form of psychic activity. For here, in a converging stream, flow the conscious and unconscious personality of the subject into a common and reconciling product. A fantasy thus framed may be the supreme expression of the unity of an individual. It may even create the individual by the consummate expression of its unity. Compare Schiller's concept of the aesthetic disposition. As a general rule, passive fantasy is never the expression of an individuality that has achieved unity, since, as already observed, it presupposes a considerable degree of dissociation, which in its turn can result only from an equally strong opposition between the conscious and the unconscious. Hence, the fantasy that breaks through into consciousness as the result of such a state can never be the perfected expression of a united individuality, but only the prevailing standpoint of the unconscious personality. The life of St. Paul is a good example of this. His conversion to the Christian faith corresponded with an acceptance of the hitherto unconscious standpoint and a repression of his previous anti-Christian point of view, which latter soon became noticeable in his hysterical fits. Hence, passive fantasy must always require a conscious criticism, if it is not to substantiate the one-sided standpoint of the unconscious antithesis, whereas active fantasy, as the product on the one hand of a conscious attitude which is not opposed to the unconscious, and on the other of unconscious processes which do not maintain an antithetic so much as a compensatory relation to consciousness, does not require this criticism but merely understanding. As with the dream, which is merely passive fantasy, a manifest and a latent meaning must be distinguished also in fantasy. The former results from the immediate perception of the fantasy image, and the immediate statement of the complex represented by the fantasy. Frequently, however, the manifest meaning hardly deserves the name, although it is always far more developed in fantasy than in the dream. Probably this arises from the fact that the dream fantasy usually requires no particular energy wherewith to make an effective opposition to the feeble resistance of the sleeping consciousness, whence it also follows that few antagonistic and only rather slight compensatory tendencies can obtain representation. Waking fantasy, on the other hand, must command a considerable sum of energy in order to overcome the inhibition proceeding from the conscious attitude. Hence, for this to take place, the unconscious antithesis must already be very important before its entrance into consciousness can become possible. If it consisted only in vague and hardly seizable indications, it would never be able so to divert conscious attention, conscious libido, upon itself, as effectually to interrupt the associated continuity of consciousness. Hence the unconscious content is dependent upon a very strong inner connection, which reveals itself in a manifest meaning. The manifest meaning always has the character of a plastic and concrete process, which, on account of its objective unreality, can never satisfy the conscious demand for understanding. Hence another signification, in other words, an interpretation or latent meaning, has to be sought. Although the existence of a latent meaning of fantasy is by no means certain, and although nothing stands in the way of an eventual challenge of the whole possibility of a latent meaning, yet the demand for a satisfying understanding is motive enough for a thoroughgoing investigation. This investigation of the latent meaning may be purely causal, inquiring into the psychological causes of the existence of the fantasy. Such an interrogation leads, on the one hand, to the more remote causes of the fantasy in the distant past, and on the other to the substantiation of the instinctive forces which, from the energic standpoint, must be made accountable for the existence of the fantasy. As is well known, Freud has made a specially intensive elaboration of this method. It is this method of interpretation to which I have applied the term reductive. The justification of a reductive view is immediately visible. It is also thoroughly intelligible that this method of interpreting psychological realities contains something which for a certain temperament is sufficiently satisfying to obviate any further claims for deeper understanding. If a man has uttered a cry for help, such a fact is adequately and satisfactorily explained when it is shown that the man in question was in instant danger of life. If a man dreams of a lavishly spread table, and it is shown that he went to bed hungry, a satisfactory explanation of his dream is provided. Or supposing a man who has repressed his sexuality in the manner of a medieval saint has sexual fantasies, this fact is sufficiently explained by a reduction to his repressed sexuality. If, however, we were to explain the vision of St. Peter by dwelling upon the fact that he is, being an-hungered, had received an invitation from the unconscious to eat animals that were unclean, or that the eating of the unclean beasts merely signified the fulfillment of a forbidden desire, with such an explanation we would still go empty away. Neither would our demand find any fuller satisfaction if, for instance, we were to trace the vision of Saul to his repressed envy of the role played by Christ among his fellow countrymen, which brought about his identification with Christ. Both explanations may contain some glimmering of truth, yet they stand in no sort of relation to the real psychology of the two apostles, conditioned as this was by the history and atmosphere of that time. Such an explanation is both too simple and too cheap. We cannot discuss the history of the world as though it were a problem of physiology, or a mere personal chronique scandaleuse, intimate personal diary. That would be altogether too limited a standpoint. Hence we are compelled very considerably to extend our conception of the latent meaning of fantasy. First of all, in its causal aspect, for the psychology of the individual can never be exhaustively explained from himself. A clear recognition is also needed of the way in which his individual psychology is conditioned by contemporary history and circumstances. It is not merely a physiological, biological, or personal problem, but also a question of contemporary history. In fine, no psychological fact can ever be exhaustively explained from its causality alone, since, as a living phenomenon, it is always indissolubly bound up with the continuity of the vital process, so that on the one side it is always something that is, and on the other it is also becoming, and therefore always creative. The psychological moment is Janus-faced. It looks both backwards and forwards. Because it is becoming, it also prepares for the future event. Were this not so, intentions, aims, the setting up of goals, the forecasting or divining of the future world, would be psychological impossibilities. If, when a man expresses an opinion, we merely relate this circumstance to the fact that, at some previous time, someone else has also expressed a view, such an explanation is practically quite inadequate. For its real understanding, not merely do we wish to know the cause of his action, but also what he intends by it. What are his aims and purposes? What does he hope to achieve by it? And usually, when we also know that, we are willing to rest satisfied. In everyday life, we immediately and quite instinctively insert a purposive standpoint into the explanation. Indeed, very often we appraise the purposive point of view as the decisive one, completely overlooking the strictly causal motive. Clearly, in instinctive recognition of the essentially creative factor of the psyche. If we so act in everyday experience, a scientific psychology must also take this circumstance into account, and not rely exclusively upon the strictly causal standpoint originally taken over from natural science, for it also has to consider the purposive nature of the psychic product. When we find everyday experience establishing the purposive orientation of the conscious content beyond any sort of doubt, we have absolutely no grounds to assume, in the absence of experience to the contrary, that this may not also be the case with the content of the unconscious. My experience gives me no reason at all to dispute the purposive orientation of unconscious contents. On the contrary, the cases in which a satisfactory interpretation could alone be attained through the introduction of the purposive standpoint are in the majority. Suppose, for example, we were again to consider the vision of Saul, but this time from the angle of the Pauline world mission, and were now to reach the conclusion that Saul, though a conscious persecutor of Christians, had unconsciously adopted the Christian standpoint, that he was finally brought to avow it by the increasing predominance and final eruption of the unconscious standpoint, and that his unconscious personality was constantly striving towards this goal in an instinctive apprehension of the necessity and importance of such an act. To me, this seems a more adequate explanation of the real significance of the event than a reductive interpretation to personal motives, albeit these latter doubtless cooperated in one form or another, since the all-too-human is never lacking. Similarly, the indication given in the Acts of the Apostles of a purposive interpretation of the vision of St. Peter is far more satisfying than a merely physiological and personal conjecture. To sum up, we may say that fantasy needs to be understood both causally as well as purposively. With the causal explanation, it appears as a symptom of a physiological or personal condition, the resultant of previous occurrences, whereas in the purposive interpretation, fantasy appears as a symbol which seeks, with the help of existing material, a clear and definite goal. It strives, as it were, to distinguish or lay hold of a certain line for the future psychological development. Active fantasy being the principal attribute of the artistic mentality, the artist is not merely a representer, he is also a creator, hence essentially an educator, since his works have the value of symbols that trace out the line of future development. Whether the actual social validity of the symbol is more general or more restricted depends upon the quality or vital capacity of the creative individuality. The more abnormal the individual, that is, the less his general fitness for life, the more limited will be the common social value of the symbols he produces, although their value may be absolute for the individuality in question. One has no right to dispute the existence of the latent meaning of fantasy, unless we also cling to the view that the general nature process contains no satisfying meaning. But natural science has developed the meaning of the nature process into the form of natural laws. These admittedly are human hypotheses advanced in explanation of the nature process, but only insofar as we have ascertained that the proposed law actually coincides with the objective process are we justified in speaking of a meaning of the natural occurrence. just so far, therefore, as we have succeeded in demonstrating a law-abiding principle in fantasy. Are we also justified in speaking of a meaning of the same? But the disclosed meaning is satisfying, or in other words, the demonstrated regularity deserves the name, only when it adequately renders the nature of fantasy. There is a law-abiding regularity in the nature process, and also a regularity of the nature process. It is certainly law-determined, and regular that one dreams when one sleeps, but there is no sort of law-determined principle that affirms anything about the nature of the dream. Its nature is a mere condition of the dream. The demonstration of a physiological source of the fantasy is a mere condition of its existence, not a law of its nature. The law of fantasy as a psychological phenomenon can only be a psychological law. We now come to the second point of our explanation of the concept of fantasy, namely imaginative activity. Imagination is the reproductive or creative activity of the mind, generally, though not a special faculty, since it may come into play in all the basic forms of psychic activity, whether thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. Fantasy as imaginative activity is, in my view, simply the direct expression of psychic vital activity. It is energy merely appearing in consciousness in the form of images or contents, just as physical energy also reveals itself as a definite physical state wherein sense organs are stimulated in physical ways. For as every physical state, from the energic standpoint, is merely a dynamic system, so too a psychic content, regarded energically, is merely a dynamic system appearing in consciousness. Hence, from this standpoint, one may affirm that fantasy, in the form of phantasm, is merely a definite sum of libido, which cannot appear in consciousness in any other way than in the form of an image. Phantasm is an idée force, key idea. Fantasy, as imaginative activity, is identical with the course of the energic psychic process. 42. Power complex. I occasionally use this term as denoting the total complex of all those ideas and strivings whose tendency it is to range the ego above other influences, thus subordinating all such influences to the ego, quite irrespective of whether they have their source in men and objective conditions, or spring from one's own subjective impulses, feelings, and thoughts. 43. Projection. Projection signifies the transveying of a subjective process into an object. It is the opposite of introjection. Accordingly, projection is a process of dissimilation wherein a subjective content is estranged from the subject and, in a sense, incorporated in the object. There are painful, incompatible contents of which the subject unburdens himself by projection, just as there are also positive values which for some reason are uncongenial to the subject, as for instance the consequences of self-depreciation. Projection is based upon the archaic identity of subject and object, but the term is used only when the necessity has already arisen for resolving the identity with the object. This necessity arises when the identity is disturbing, that is, when, through the absence of the projected content, the process of adaptation is materially prejudiced, so that the restoration of the rejected content becomes desirable to the subject. From this moment, the hitherto partial identity maintains the character of projection. This expression, therefore, denotes a state of identity which has become noticeable and, therefore, the object of criticism, whether it be the self-criticism of the subject or the objective criticism of another. We may discriminate between passive and active projection. The former is the customary form of every pathological and many normal projections. It springs from no purpose and is a purely automatic occurrence. The latter form is an essential constituent of the act of feeling into. Feeling into as a whole is a process of introjection, since it serves to bring the object into an intimate relation with the subject. In order to establish this relation, the subject detaches a content, a feeling for instance, from himself. He then transvays it into, therewith animating, the object, which he thus relates to the subjective sphere. The active form of projection, however, is also an act of judgment, which aims at a separation of subject and object. In this case, a subjective judgment is detached from the subject as a valid statement of the case, and is transveyed into the object. By so doing, the subject distinguishes himself from the object. Accordingly, projection is a process of introversion, since in contrast to introjection, it leads not to a linking up and assimilation, but to a differentiation and separation of subject from object. Hence it plays a leading part in paranoia, which usually ends in a total isolation of the subject. 44. Rational. The rational is the reasonable, that which accords with reason. I conceive reason as an attitude whose principle is to shape thought, feeling, and action in accordance with objective values. Objective values are established by the average experience of external facts on the one hand, and of inner psychological facts on the other. Such experiences, however, could represent no objective value if valued as such by the subject, for this would already amount to an act of reason. But the reasoning attitude, which permits us to declare as valid objective values in general, is not the work of the individual subject, but the product of human history. Most objective values, and reason itself among them, are firmly established complexes handed down to us through the ages, to the organization of which countless generations have labored with the same necessity with which the nature of the living organism in general reacts to the average and constantly recurring conditions of the environment, confronting them with corresponding function complexes, as, for instance, the eye, which so perfectly corresponds with the nature of light. We might, therefore, speak of a pre-existing metaphysical world reason, if, as Schopenhauer has already pointed out, the reaction of the living organism that corresponds with average external influence were not the indispensable condition of its existence. Human reason, therefore, is merely the expression of human adaptability to the average occurrence, which has gradually become deposited in solidly organized complexes, constituting our objective values. Thus, the laws of reason are those laws which rule and designate the average correct or adapted attitude. Everything is rational which harmonizes with these laws, and everything irrational which contravenes them. Thinking and feeling are rational functions insofar as they are decisively influenced by the motive of reflection. They attain their fullest significance when in fullest possible accord with the laws of reason. The irrational functions, on the contrary, are such as aim at pure perception, for example, intuition and sensation, because, as far as possible, they are forced to dispense with the rational, which presupposes the exclusion of everything that is outside reason, in order to be able to reach the most complete perception of the whole course of events. 45. Reductive. Leading back. I employ this expression to denote that method of psychological interpretation which regards the unconscious product not from the symbolic point of view, but merely as a semiotic expression, a sort of sign or symptom of an underlying process. Accordingly, the reductive method treats the unconscious product in the sense of a leading back to the elements and basic processes, irrespective of whether such products are reminiscences of actual events, or whether they arise from elementary processes affecting the psyche. Hence, the reductive method is orientated backwards, in contrast to the constructive method, whether in the historical sense or in the merely figurative sense of a tracing back of complex and differentiated factors to the general and elementary. The methods both of Freud and of Adler are reductive, since in both cases there is a reduction to elementary processes, either of wishing or striving, which in the last resort are infantile or primitive, Hence the unconscious product necessarily acquires the value of a merely figurative or unreal expression, for which the term symbol is really not applicable. The effect of reduction as regards the real significance of the unconscious product is disintegrating, since it is either traced back to its historical antecedents, and so robbed of its intrinsic significance, or it is once again reintegrated into the same elementary process from which it arose. 46. Self. See ego. 47. Sensation. According to my conception, this is one of the basic psychological functions. See function. Wundt also reckons sensation among the elementary psychic phenomena. Sensation, or sensing, is that psychological function which transmits a physical stimulus to perception. It is therefore identical with perception. Sensation must be strictly distinguished from feeling, since the latter is an entirely different process, although it may, for instance, be associated with sensation as feeling tone. Sensation is related not only to the outer stimuli but also to the inner, that is, to changes in the internal organs. Primarily, therefore, sensation is sense perception, that is, perception transmitted via the sense organs and bodily senses, kinesthetic, vasomotor sensation, etc. On the one hand, it is an element of presentation since it transmits to the presenting function the perceived image of the outer object. On the other hand, it is an element of feeling because through the perception of bodily changes, it lends the character of affect to feeling. See affect. Because sensation transmits physical changes to consciousness, it also represents the physiological impulse, but it is not identical with it since it is merely a perceptive function. A distinction must be made between sensuous or concrete and abstract sensation. The former includes the forms above alluded to, whereas the latter designates an abstracted kind of sensation. That is, a sensation that is separated from other psychological elements. For concrete sensation never appears as pure sensation, but is always mixed up with presentations, feelings, and thoughts. Abstract sensation, on the contrary, represents a differentiated kind of perception, which might be termed aesthetic insofar as it follows its own principle and is as equally detached from every admixture of the differences of the perceived object as from the subjective admixture of feeling and thought, thus raising itself to a degree of purity which is never attained by concrete sensation. The concrete sensation of a flower, for instance, transmits not only the perception of the flower itself, but also an image of the stem, leaves, habitat, etc. It is also directly mingled with the feelings of pleasure or dislike, which the sight of it provokes, or with the scent perceptions, simultaneously excited, or with thoughts concerning its botanical classification. Abstract sensation, on the other hand, immediately picks out the most salient sensuous attribute of the flower, as, for instance, its brilliant redness, and makes it the sole, or at least the principal content of consciousness, entirely detached from all the other admixtures alluded to above. Abstract sensation is mainly suited to the artist. Like every abstraction, it is a product of the differentiation of function. Hence there is nothing primordial about it. The primordial form of the function is always concrete, that is, blended. See Archaism and Concretism. Concrete sensation, as such, is a reactive phenomenon, while abstract sensation, like every abstraction, is always linked up with the will, that is, the element of direction. The will, that is directed towards the abstraction of sensation, is both the expression and the activity of the aesthetic, sensational attitude. Sensation is a prominent characteristic both in the child and the primitive, insofar as it always predominates over thinking and feeling, though not necessarily over intuition. For I regard sensation as conscious, and intuition as unconscious perception, For me, sensation and intuition represent a pair of opposites, or two mutually compensating functions, like thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling as independent functions are developed both ontogenetically and phylogenetically from sensation, and equally, of course, from intuition as the necessary counterpart of sensation. Insofar as sensation is an elementary phenomenon, it is something absolutely given, something that, in contrast to thinking and feeling, is not subject to the laws of reason. I therefore term it an irrational function, although reason contrives to assimilate a great number of sensations into rational associations. A man whose whole attitude is orientated by the principle of sensation belongs to the sensation type. See types. Normal sensations are proportionate. That is, their value approximately corresponds with the intensity of the physical stimulus. Pathological sensations are disproportionate. That is, either abnormally weak or abnormally strong. In the former case, they are inhibited, in the latter, exaggerated. The inhibition is the result of the predominance of another function. The exaggeration proceeds from an abnormal amalgamation with another function. For example, a blending with a still undifferentiated feeling or thinking function. In such a case, the exaggeration of sensation ceases as soon as the function with which sensation is fused is differentiated in its own right. The psychology of the neuroses yields extremely illuminating examples of this, where, for instance, a strong sexualization, Freud, of other functions very often prevails. For example, a blending of sexual sensation with other functions. 48. Soul, ANIMA. I have found sufficient cause in my investigations into the structure of the unconscious to make a conceptual distinction between the soul and the psyche. By the psyche, I understand the totality of all the psychic processes, both conscious as well as unconscious. Whereas by soul, I understand a definitely demarcated function complex that is best characterized as a personality. In order to describe more exactly what I mean by this, I must introduce still remoter points of view, such in particular as the phenomena of somnambulism, of character duplication, of dissociation of personality, the investigation of which is primarily due to French research, and which has enabled us to recognize the possibility of a plurality of personalities in one and the same individual. It is at once evident that such a plurality of personalities can never appear in a normal individual. But the possibility of a dissociation of personality which these cases represent must also exist, at least potentially, within the range of normality. And, as a matter of fact, a moderately acute psychological observation can succeed without much difficulty in proving at least the traces of character splitting in the normal individual. For example, we have only to observe a man rather closely under varying circumstances to discover that a transition from one milieu to another brings about a striking alteration in his personality, whereby a sharply outlined and distinctly changed character emerges. The proverbial expression, angel abroad and devil at home, is a formulation of the phenomenon of character splitting derived from everyday experience. A definite milieu demands a definite attitude. Corresponding with the duration or frequency with which such a milieu attitude is demanded, the more or less habitual it becomes. Great numbers of men of the educated classes are obliged to move in two, for the most part, totally different milieux, namely in the family and domestic circle and in the world of affairs. These two totally different environments demand two totally different attitudes, which, in proportion to the degree of identification of the ego with the momentary attitude, produce a duplication of character. In accordance with social conditions and necessities, the social character is orientated, on the one hand, by the expectations or obligations of the social milieu, and on the other by the social aims and efforts of the subject. The domestic character is, as a rule, more the product of the subject's laissez-aller, indolence, and emotional demands. Whence it frequently happens that men who in public life are extremely energetic, bold, obstinate, willful, and inconsiderate, appear good-natured, mild, accommodating, even weak, when at home, within the sphere of domesticity. Which, then, is the true character, the real personality? This is a question it is often impossible to answer. This brief consideration will show that, even in the normal individual, character splitting is by no means an impossibility. We are therefore perfectly justified in treating the question of dissociation of personality also as a problem of normal psychology. According to my view, then, to pursue the discussion, the above question should be met with a frank avowal that such a man has no real character at all. That is, he is not individual, but collective. That is, he corresponds with general circumstances and expectations. Were he an individual, he would have but one and the same character with every variation of attitude. It would not be identical with the momentary attitude, neither could it nor would it prevent his individuality from finding expression in one state just as clearly as in another. He is an individual, of course, like every being, but an unconscious one. Through his more or less complete identification with the attitude of the moment, he at least deceives others and also often himself as to his real character. He puts on a mask, which he knows corresponds with his conscious intentions, while it also meets with the requirements and opinions of his environment, so that first one motive, then the other, is in the ascendant. This mask, namely the ad hoc, adopted attitude, I have called the persona, which was the designation given to the mask worn by the actors of antiquity. A man who is identified with this mask I would call personal, as opposed to individual. Both the attitudes of the case considered above are collective personalities, which may be simply summed up under the name persona or personae. I have already suggested above that the real individuality is different from both. Thus the persona is a function complex which has come into existence for reasons of adaptation or necessary convenience, but by no means is it identical with the individuality. The function complex of the persona is exclusively concerned with the relation to the object. The relation of the individual to the outer object must be sharply distinguished from the relation to the subject. By the subject I mean those vague, dim stirrings, feelings, thoughts and sensations which have no demonstrable flow towards the object from the continuity of conscious experience, but well up like a disturbing, inhibiting or at times beneficent influence from the dark inner depths, from the background and underground of consciousness, which in their totality constitute one's perception of the unconscious life. The subject, conceived as the inner object, is the unconscious. There is a relation to the inner object, namely an inner attitude, just as there is a relation to the outer object, namely an outer attitude. It is quite intelligible that this inner attitude, by reason of its extremely intimate and inaccessible nature, is far less widely known than the outer attitude, which is immediately perceived by everyone. Nevertheless, the task of making a concept of this inner attitude does not seem to me impossible. All those so-called accidental inhibitions, fancies, moods, vague feelings, and fragments of fantasy, which occasionally harass and disturb the accomplishment of concentrated work, not to mention the repose of the most normal of men, and which evoke rational explanations either in the form of physical causes or reasons of like nature, usually have their origin not in the reasons ascribed to them by consciousness, but in the perceptions of unconscious processes, which in fact they are. Among such phenomena, dreams also naturally belong. These are admittedly liable to be accounted for by such external and superficial causes as indigestion, sleeping on one's back, and the like, in spite of the fact that such explanations never withstand a searching criticism. The attitude of individual men to these things is extremely variable. One man will not allow himself to be disturbed in the smallest degree by his inner processes. He can, as it were, ignore them entirely, while another is in the highest degree subject to them. At the first waking moment, some fantasy or other, or a disagreeable feeling, spoils his temper for the whole day. A vague, unpleasant sensation suggests the idea of a secret malady, or a dream leaves him with a gloomy foreboding, although in other ways he is by no means superstitious. To others, again, these unconscious stirrings have only a very episodic access, or only a certain category of them come to the surface. For one man, perhaps, they have never yet appeared to consciousness as anything worth thinking about, while for another they are a problem of daily brooding. The one values them physiologically or ascribes to them the conduct of his neighbours. Another finds in them a religious revelation. These entirely different ways of dealing with the stirrings of the unconscious are just as habitual as the attitudes to the outer object. The inner attitude, therefore, corresponds with just as definite a function complex as the outer attitude. Those cases in which the inner psychic processes appear to be entirely overlooked are lacking a typical inner attitude, just as little as those who constantly overlook the outer object, and the reality of facts lack a typical outer attitude. The persona of these latter, by no means infrequent cases, has the character of unrelatedness, or at times even a blind inconsiderateness, which frequently yields only to the harshest blows of fate. Not seldom it is just those individuals whose persona is characterized by a rigid inconsiderateness and absence of relations who possess an attitude to the unconscious processes which suggest a character of extreme susceptibility. As they are inflexible and inaccessible outwardly, so are they weak, flaccid, and determinable in relation to their inner processes. In such cases, therefore, the inner attitude corresponds with an inner personality diametrically opposed and different from the outer. I know a man, for instance, who without pity blindly destroyed the happiness of those nearest to him, and yet he would interrupt his journey when travelling on important business just to enjoy the beauty of a forest scene glimpsed from the carriage window. Cases of this kind are doubtless familiar to everyone. It is needless, therefore, to enumerate further examples. With the same justification as daily experience furnishes us for speaking of an outer personality, are we also justified in assuming the existence of an inner personality? The inner personality is the manner of one's behaviour towards the inner psychic processes. It is the inner attitude, the character, that is turned towards the unconscious. I term the outer attitude or outer character the persona, the inner attitude I term the anima or soul. In the same degree as an attitude is habitual, is it a more or less firmly welded function complex with which the ego may be more or less identified. This is plastically expressed in language. Of a man who has an habitual attitude towards certain situations, we're accustomed to say, he's quite another man when doing this or that. This is a practical demonstration of the independence of the function complex of an habitual attitude. It is as though another personality had taken possession of the individual, as though another spirit had entered into him. The same autonomy as is so often granted to the outer attitude is also claimed by the soul or inner attitude. One of the most difficult of all educational achievements is this task of changing the outer attitude or persona. But to change the soul is just as difficult, since its structure tends to be just as firmly welded as is that of the persona. Just as the persona is an entity which often appears to constitute the whole character of a man, even accompanying him practically without change throughout his entire life, so the soul is also a definitely circumscribed entity, with a character which may prove unalterably firm and independent. Hence it frequently offers itself to characterization and description. As regards the character of the soul, my experience confirms the validity of the general principle that it maintains, on the whole, a complementary relation to the outer character. Experience teaches us that the soul is wont to contain all those general human qualities the conscious attitude lacks. The tyrant tormented by bad dreams, gloomy forebodings, and inner fears is a typical figure. Outwardly inconsiderate, harsh, and unapproachable, he is inwardly susceptible to every shadow and subject to every fancy, as though he were the least independent and the most impressionable of men. Thus his soul contains those general human qualities of suggestibility and weakness which are wholly lacking in his outer attitude or persona. Where the persona is intellectual, the soul is quite certainly sentimental. That the complementary character of the soul is also concerned with the sex character is a fact which can no longer seriously be doubted. A very feminine woman has a masculine soul, and a very manly man a feminine soul. This opposition is based upon the fact that a man, for instance, is not in all things wholly masculine, but has also certain feminine traits. The more manly his outer attitude, the more will his womanly traits be effaced. These, then, appear in the soul. This circumstance explains why it is that the very manly men are most subject to characteristic weakness. Their attitude to the unconscious has a womanly weakness and impressionability, and vice versa. It is often just the most womanly women who, in respect of certain inner things, have an extreme intractableness, obstinacy, and willfulness, which qualities are found in such intensity only in the outer attitude of men. These are manly traits, whose exclusion from the womanly outer attitude makes them qualities of the soul. If, therefore, we speak of the anima of a man, we must logically speak of the animus of a woman, if we are to give the soul of a woman its right name. Whereas logic and objective reality commonly prevail in the outer attitude of man, or are at least regarded as an ideal, in the case of woman it is feeling. But in the soul the relations are reversed. Inwardly it is the man who feels, and the woman who reflects. Hence man's greater liability to total despair, while a woman can always find comfort and hope. Hence man is more liable to put an end to himself than woman. However prone a woman may be to fall a victim to social circumstances, as in prostitution for instance, a man is equally delivered over to impulses from the unconscious in the form of alcoholism and other vices. As regards the general human characters, the character of the soul may be deduced from that of the persona. Everything which should normally be in the outer attitude, but is decidedly wanting there, will invariably be found in the inner attitude. This is a basic rule, which my experience has borne out again and again. But as regards individual qualities, nothing can be deduced about them in this way. We can be certain only that when a man is identical with his persona, the individual qualities are associated with the soul. It is this association which gives rise to the symbol, so often appearing in dreams, of the soul's pregnancy. This symbol has its source in the primordial image of the hero birth. The child that is to be born signifies the individuality, which, though existing, is not yet conscious. Hence, in the same way as the persona, which expresses one's adaptation to the milieu, is as a rule strongly influenced and shaped by the milieu, so the soul is just as profoundly moulded by the unconscious and its qualities. Just as the persona almost necessarily takes on primitive traits in a primitive milieu, so the soul assumes the archaic characters of the unconscious as well as its protective, symbolic character, whence arise the pregnant and creative qualities of the inner attitude. Identity with the persona automatically conditions an unconscious identity with the soul, because when the subject or ego is not differentiated from the persona, it can have no conscious relation to the processes of the unconscious. Hence it is these processes, it is identical with them. The man who is unconditionally his outer role therewith delivers himself over unquestioningly to the inner processes. That is, he will even frustrate his outer role by absolute inner necessity, reducing it ad absurdum. Enantiodromia. A steady holding to the individual line is thereby excluded, and his life runs its course in inevitable opposition. Moreover, in such a case the soul is always projected into a corresponding real object, with which a relation of almost absolute dependence exists. Every reaction proceeding from this object has an immediate, inwardly arresting effect upon the subject. Tragic ties are frequently formed in this way. See soul image. 49. Soul image. The soul image is a definite image, among those produced by the unconscious. Just as the persona, or outer attitude, is represented in dreams by the images of certain persons who possess the outstanding qualities of the persona in especially marked form, so the soul, the inner attitude of the unconscious, is similarly represented by definite persons whose particular qualities correspond with those of the soul. Such an image is called a soul image. Occasionally these images are quite unknown, or mythological figures. With men, the soul, that is the anima, is usually figured by the unconscious in the person of a woman. With women, it is a man. In every case where the individuality is unconscious, and therefore associated with the soul image has the character of the same sex. In all those cases in which an identity with the persona, see soul, is present, and the soul accordingly is unconscious, the soul image is transferred into a real person. This person is the object of an intense love, or an equally intense hatred, possibly even fear. The influence of such a person has the character of something immediate and absolutely compelling, since it always evokes an affective response. The affect depends upon the fact that a real conscious adaptation to the object who represents the soul image is impossible. Because the objective relation is alike impossible and non-existent, the libido gets dammed up and explodes in a release of affect. Affects always occur where there is a failure of adaptation. A conscious adaptation to the object, who represents the soul image, is impossible only when the subject is unconscious of the anima. Were he conscious of it, it could be distinguished from the object, whose immediate effects might then be resolved, since the potency of the object depends upon the projection of the soul image. For a man, a woman is best fitted to be the bearer of his soul image, by virtue of the womanly quality of his soul. Similarly, a man in the case of a woman. Wherever an unconditional or almost magical relation exists between the sexes, it is always a question of projection of the soul image. Since such relations are common, just as frequently must the soul be unconscious. That is, great numbers of men must be unaware of how they are related to the inner psychic processes. Because such unconsciousness goes always hand in hand with a correspondingly complete identification with the persona, see soul, it clearly follows that the latter also must occur very frequently. This accords with reality, for, as a matter of fact, large numbers of men are wholly identified with their outer attitude, and therefore have no conscious relation to their inner processes. But the converse may also happen, namely, where the soul image is not projected but remains with the subject, whereupon an identification with the soul is liable to result just insofar as the subject is himself convinced that his manner of behavior to his inner processes is also his unique and actual character. In such a case, the unconsciousness of the persona results in its projection upon an object, more especially of the same sex, thus providing a foundation for many cases of more or less admitted homosexuality, and of father transferences in men or mother transferences in women. Such cases are always persons with defective external adaptation and comparative unrelatedness, because the identification with the soul begets an attitude with a predominant orientation towards the inner processes, whereby the object is deprived of its determining influence. Whenever the soul image is projected, an unconditional affective tie to the object appears. If it is not projected, a relatively unadapted state results, which Freud has partially described as narcissism. The projection of the soul image offers a release from a too great preoccupation with the inner processes, insofar as the behavior of the object harmonizes with the soul image. The subject is thus enabled to live his persona and to develop it further. In the long run, however, the object will scarcely be able to correspond consistently with the soul image, although many women succeed by constantly disregarding their own lives in representing their husband's soul image for a very considerable time. The biological feminine instinct assists them in this. A man may unconsciously do the same for his wife, only he is thereby prompted to deeds which, for good or evil, finally exceed his powers. In his case also the biological masculine instinct is an assistance. If the soul image is not projected, a thoroughly morbid differentiation of the relation to the unconscious gradually develops. The subject is increasingly overwhelmed by unconscious contents, which his defective relation to the object makes him powerless to organize or to put to any sort of use. Obviously, such contents as these very seriously prejudice the relation to the object. These attitudes only represent, of course, the two extremes between which the more normal attitudes are to be found. The normal man, as we know, is not distinguished by any special clarity, purity, or depth in the matter of psychological phenomena, but commonly inclines to a certain indistinctness in such matters. In men with a good-natured and inoffensive outer attitude, the soul image, as a rule, has a rather malevolent character. A good literary example of this is the demonic woman who accompanies Zeus in Spittler's Olympischer Frühling. For the idealistic woman, a depraved man is often a bearer of the soul image. Hence the salvation fantasy so frequent in such cases. The same thing often happens with men, where the prostitute is surrounded with the halo of a soul crying for succor. 50. Subjective plane. By interpretation upon the subjective plane, I understand that conception of a dream or fantasy in which the persons or conditions appearing therein are related to subjective factors entirely belonging to the subject's own psyche. It is common knowledge that the image of an object existing in our psyche is never exactly like the object, but at most only similar. Although admittedly brought about through sense perceptions and their apperception, it is actually the product of processes inherent in the psyche, whose activity the object merely stimulates. Experience shows that the evidence of our senses very largely coincides with the qualities of the object. But our apperception is subject to well-nigh incalculable subjective influences, which render the correct knowledge of a human character extraordinarily difficult. Moreover, such a complex psychic factor as is presented by a human character offers only a very slight field for pure sense perception. Its cognition also demands feeling into, reflection, and intuition. The final judgment that issues from these complex factors is always of very doubtful value. Necessarily, therefore, the image we form of a human object is to a very large extent subjectively conditioned. Hence, in practical psychology, we should be well advised to differentiate the image, or imago, of a man quite definitely from his real existence. Not infrequently, as a result of its extremely subjective origin, an imago is actually more an image of a subjective function complex than of the object itself. In the analytical treatment of unconscious products, therefore, it is essential that the imago shall not immediately be assumed to be identical with the object. It is wiser to regard it as an image of the subjective relation to the object. This is what is meant by the consideration of a product upon the subjective plane. The treatment of an unconscious product upon this plane results in the presence of subjective judgments and tendencies, of which the bearer is made the object. When, therefore, an object imago appears in an unconscious product, it is not definitely concerned with the real object per se, but just as much, possibly even more, with a subjective function complex. See soul image. The application of meaning upon this plane yields us a comprehensive psychological explanation, not only of dreams, but also of literary works, in which the individual figures represent relatively autonomous function complexes in the psyche of the poet. 51. Symbol. The concept of a symbol should, in my view, be strictly differentiated from that of a mere sign. Symbolic and semiotic interpretations are entirely different things. In his book, Ferrero does not speak of symbols in the strict sense, but of signs. For instance, the old custom of handing over a sod of turf at the sale of a piece of land might be described as symbolic in the vulgar use of the word. But actually it is purely semiotic in character. The piece of turf is a sign or token representing the whole estate. The winged wheel worn by the railway employé is not a symbol of the railway, but a sign that distinguishes the personnel of the railway. But the symbol always presupposes that the chosen expression is the best possible description or formula of a relatively unknown fact. A fact, however, which is nonetheless recognized or postulated as existing. Thus, when the winged wheel badge of the railway employé is explained as a symbol, it is tantamount to saying that the man has to do with an unknown entity, whose nature cannot be differently or better expressed than by a winged wheel. Every view which interprets the symbolic expression as an analogous or abbreviated expression of a known thing is semiotic. A conception which interprets the symbolic expression as the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing, which cannot conceivably therefore be more clearly or characteristically represented, is symbolic. A view which interprets the symbolic expression as an intentional transcription or transformation of a known thing is allegoric. The explanation of the cross as a symbol of divine love is semiotic, since divine love describes the fact to be expressed better and more aptly than a cross, which can have many other meanings. Whereas that interpretation of the cross is symbolic which puts it above all imaginable explanations, regarding it as an expression of an unknown and as yet incomprehensible fact, of a mystical or transcendent, that is, psychological character, which simply finds its most striking and appropriate representation in the cross. Insofar as a symbol is a living thing, it is the expression of a thing not to be characterized in any other or better way. The symbol is alive only insofar as it is pregnant with meaning. But if its meaning is born out of it, that is, if that expression should be found which formulates the sought, expected or divined thing still better than the hitherto accepted symbol, then the symbol is dead. That is, it possesses only a historical significance. We may still go on speaking of it as a symbol under the tacit assumption that we're speaking of it as it was before its better expression had been born from it. The way in which St. Paul and the early mystical speculators handle the symbol of the cross shows that for them it was a living symbol which represented the inexpressible in an unsurpassable way. For every esoteric explanation, the symbol is dead, since through esotericism it has been brought to a better expression, at least ostensibly, whereupon it merely serves as a conventional sign for associations which are more completely and better known elsewhere. Only for the exoteric standpoint is the symbol always living. An expression that stands for a known thing always remains merely a sign and is never a symbol. It is therefore quite impossible to make a living symbol, that is, one that is pregnant with meaning, from known associations. For what is thus manufactured never contains more than was put into it. every psychic product, insofar as it is the best possible expression at the moment, for a fact as yet unknown or only relatively known, may be regarded as a symbol, provided also that we are prepared to accept the expression as designating something that is only divined and not yet clearly conscious. Inasmuch as every scientific theory contains a hypothesis, and therefore an anticipatory designation of a fact still essentially unknown, it is a symbol. Furthermore, every psychological phenomenon is a symbol when we are willing to assume that it purports or signifies something different and still greater, something therefore which is withheld from present knowledge. This assumption is absolutely possible to every consciousness which is orientated to the deeper meaning of things, and to the possibilities such an attitude enfolds. Such an assumption is impossible only for this same consciousness when it has itself contrived an expression, merely to contain or affirm just as much as the purpose of its creation intended, as for example a mathematical term. For another consciousness, however, this restriction does not exist at all. It can also conceive the mathematical term as a symbol of an unknown psychic fact concealed within the purpose of its production, insofar as this fact is demonstrably unknown to the man who created the semiotic expression, and therefore could not be the object of any conscious use. Whether a thing is a symbol or not depends chiefly upon the attitude of the consciousness considering it, as for instance a mind that regards the given fact not merely as such, but also as an expression of the yet unknown. Hence, it is quite possible for a man to produce a fact which does not appear in the least symbolic to himself, although profoundly so to another. The converse is also possible. There are undoubtedly products whose symbolical character not merely depends upon the attitude of the considering consciousness, but manifests itself spontaneously in a symbolical effect upon the regarding subject. Such products are so fashioned that they must forfeit every sort of meaning, unless the symbolical one is conceded them. As a pure actuality, a triangle in which an eye is enclosed is so meaningless that it is impossible for the observer to regard it as mere accidental trifling. Such a figure immediately conjures up a symbolical conception of it. This effect is supported either by a frequent and identical occurrence of the same figure, or by a particularly careful and arresting manner of production, which is the actual expression of a particular value placed upon it. Symbols that are without the spontaneous effect just described are either dead, that is, outstripped by a better formulation, or else products whose symbolical nature depends exclusively upon the attitude of the observing consciousness. This attitude that conceives the given phenomenon as symbolic may be briefly described as the symbolical attitude. It is only partially justified by the behavior of things. For the rest, it is the outcome of a definite view of life, endowing the occurrence, whether great or small, with a meaning to which a certain deeper value is given than to pure actuality. This view of things stands opposed to another view, which lays the accent upon pure actuality and subordinates meaning to facts. For this latter attitude there can be no symbol at all, wherever the symbolism depends exclusively upon the manner of consideration. But even for such an attitude, symbols also exist, namely those that prompt the observer to the conjecture of a hidden meaning. An image of a god with the head of a bull can certainly be explained as a human body with a bull's head, but this explanation could scarcely hold the scales against the symbolic interpretation, since the symbol is too arresting to be entirely overlooked. A symbol that seems to obtrude its symbolical nature need not be alive. Its effect may be wholly restricted, for instance, to the historical or philosophical intellect. It merely arouses intellectual or aesthetic interest. But a symbol really lives only when it is the best and highest possible expression of something divined, but not yet known even to the observer. For under these circumstances it provokes unconscious participation. It advances and creates life. As Faust says, how differently this token works upon me. The living symbol shapes and formulates an essential unconscious factor. And the more generally this factor prevails, the more general is the operation of the symbol, for in every soul it touches an associated chord. Since on the one hand the symbol is the best possible expression of what is still unknown, an expression moreover which cannot be surpassed for the given epoch, it must proceed from the most complex and differentiated contemporary mental atmosphere. But since, on the other hand, the living symbol must embrace and contain that which relates a considerable group of men for such an effect to be within its power, it must contain just that which may be common to a large group of men. Hence this can never be the most highly differentiated or the highest attainable, since only the very few could attain to or understand it, but it must be something that is still so primitive that its omnipresence stands beyond all doubt. Only when the symbol comprises this something and brings it to the highest possible expression has it any general efficacy. Therein consists the potent and at the same time redeeming effect of a living, social symbol. All that I have now said concerning the social symbol holds good for the individual symbol. There are individual psychic products whose manifest symbolic character at once compels a symbolical conception. For the individual, they possess a similar functional significance as the social symbol for a larger human group. Such products, however, never have an exclusively conscious or unconscious source, but proceed from a uniform cooperation of both. Purely conscious products are no more convincingly symbolic, per se, than purely unconscious products, and vice versa. It devolves, therefore, upon the symbolical attitude of the observing consciousness to endow them with the character of a symbol, but they may equally well be conceived as mere causally conditioned facts, in much the same sense as one might regard the red exanthema of scarlet fever as a symbol of the disease. In such a case, of course, it is correct to speak of a symptom, not of a symbol. In my view, therefore, Freud is justified when, from his standpoint, he speaks of symptomatic rather than symbolical actions. Since for him these phenomena are not symbolic in the sense here defined, but are symptomatic signs of a definite and generally known underlying process. There are, of course, neurotics who regard their unconscious products, which are primarily morbid symptoms, as symbols of supreme importance. Generally, however, this is not the case. On the contrary, the neurotic of today is only too prone to regard a product that may actually be full of significance as a symptom. The fact that there are two distinct and mutually contradictory views, eagerly advocated on either side, concerning the meaning and meaninglessness of things, can only show that processes clearly exist which express no particular meaning, being in fact mere consequences or symptoms, while there are other processes which bear within them a hidden meaning, processes which have not merely arisen from something, but also tend to become something and are therefore symbols. It is left to our judgment and criticism to decide whether the thing we are dealing with is a symptom or a symbol. The symbol is always a creation of an extremely complex nature, since data proceeding from every psychic function have entered into its composition. Hence its nature is neither rational nor irrational. It certainly has one side that accords with reason, but it has also another side that is inaccessible to reason. For not only the data of reason, but also the irrational data of pure inner and outer perception have entered into its nature. The prospective meaning and pregnant significance of the symbol appeals just as strongly to thinking as to feeling, while its peculiar plastic imagery, when shaped into sensuous form, stimulates sensation just as much as intuition. The living symbol cannot come to birth in an inert or poorly developed mind, for such a man will rest content with the already existing symbols offered by established tradition. Only the passionate yearning of a highly developed mind, for whom the dictated symbol no longer contains the highest reconciliation in one expression can create a new symbol. But inasmuch as the symbol proceeds from his highest and latest mental achievement and must also include the deepest roots of his being, it cannot be a one-sided product of the most highly differentiated mental functions, but must at least have an equal source in the lowest and most primitive motions of his psyche. For this cooperation of antithetic states to be at all possible, they must both stand side by side in fullest conscious opposition. Such a condition necessarily entails a violent disunion with oneself, even to a point where thesis and antithesis mutually deny each other, while the ego is still forced to recognize its absolute participation in both. But should there exist a subordination of one part, the symbol will be disproportionately the product of the other, and in corresponding degree will be less a symbol than a symptom, namely the symptom of a repressed antithesis. But to the extent in which a symbol is merely a symptom, it also lacks the redeeming effect, since it fails to express the full right to existence of every portion of the psyche, constantly calling to mind the suppression of the antithesis, although consciousness may omit to take this into account. But when the opposites are given a complete equality of right, attested to by the ego's unconditioned participation in both thesis and antithesis, a suspension of the will results, for the will can no longer be operative while every motive has an equally strong countermotive by its side. Since life cannot tolerate suspension, a damming up of vital energy results, which would lead to an insupportable condition from the tension of the opposites, did not a new reconciling function arise, which could lead above and beyond the opposites. It arises naturally, however, from the regression of the libido effected by its damming up. Since progress is made impossible by the total disunion of the will, the libido streams backwards. The stream flows back, as it were, to its source. That is, the suspension and inactivity of the conscious brings about an activity of the unconscious where all the differentiated functions have their common archaic root, and where that promiscuity of contents exists, of which the primitive mentality still exhibits numerous remainders. Through the activity of the unconscious, a content is unearthed which is constellated by thesis and antithesis in equal measure, and is related to both in a compensatory relation. Since this content discloses a relation to both thesis and antithesis, it forms a middle territory, upon which the opposites can be reconciled. Suppose, for example, we conceive the opposition to be sensuality versus spirituality. Then, by virtue of its wealth of spiritual associations, the mediatory content born from the unconscious offers a welcome expression to the spiritual thesis, and by virtue of its plastic sensuousness, it embraces the sensual antithesis. But the ego, rent between thesis and antithesis, finds in the uniting middle territory its counterpart, its reconciling and unique expression, and eagerly seizes upon it, in order to be delivered from its division. Hence the energy created by the tension of the opposites flows into the mediatory expression, protecting it against the conflict of the opposites, which forthwith begins both about it and within, since both are striving to resolve the new expression in their own specific sense. Spirituality tries to make something spiritual out of the unconscious expression, while sensuality aims at something sensual, the one wishing to create science and art from the new expression, the other sensual experience. The resolution of the unconscious product into either is successful only when the incompletely divided ego clings rather more to one side than the other. Should one side succeed in resolving the unconscious product, it does not fall alone to that side, but the ego goes with it, whereupon an identification of the ego with the most favored function, see inferior function, inevitably follows. This results in a subsequent repetition of the process of division upon a higher plane. But if through the resoluteness of the ego neither thesis nor antithesis can succeed in resolving the unconscious product, this is sufficient demonstration that the unconscious expression is superior to both sides. The steadfastness of the ego and the superiority of the mediatory expression over thesis and antithesis are to my mind correlates, each mutually conditioning the other. It would appear at times as though the fixity of the inborn individuality were the decisive factor, at times as though the mediatory expression possessed a superior force, prompting the ego to absolute steadfastness. But in reality, it is quite conceivable that the firmness and certainty of the individuality on the one hand, and the superior force of the mediatory product on the other, are merely tokens of one and the same fact. When the mediatory product is preserved in this way, it fashions a raw product which is for construction, not for dissolution, and which becomes a common object for both thesis and antithesis. Thus it becomes a new content that governs the whole attitude, putting an end to the division and forcing the energy of the opposites into a common channel. The suspension of life is therewith abolished, and the individual life can compass a greater range with new energy and new goals. In its totality, I've named the process just described the transcendent function, and here I'm not using the term function in the sense of a basic function, but rather as a complex function compounded of other functions. Neither with transcendent do I wish to designate any metaphysical quality, but merely the fact that by this function a transition is made possible from the one attitude to the other. The raw material, when elaborated by the thesis and antithesis, which in its process of formation reconciles the opposites, is the living symbol. In the essential rawness of its material, defying time and dissolution, lies its prospective significance, and in the form which its crude material receives through the influence of the opposites, lies its effective power over all the psychic functions. Indications of the foundations of the symbol-forming process are to be found in the scanty records of the initiation period experienced by founders of religions, for example, Jesus and Satan, Buddha and Mara, Luther and the devil, Zwingli and his previous worldly life, also Goethe's conception of the rejuvenation of Faust through the contract with the devil. Towards the end of Zarathustra we find a striking example of the suppression of the antithesis in the figure of the ugliest man. (52) Synthetic. See Constructive. 53. Thinking. This I regard as one of the four basic psychological functions. See Function. Thinking is that psychological function which, in accordance with its own laws, brings given presentations into conceptual connection. It is an apperceptive activity, and as such must be differentiated into active and passive thought activity. Active thinking is an act of will, passive thinking an occurrence. In the former case, I submit the representation to a deliberate act of judgment. In the latter case, conceptual connections establish themselves, and judgments are formed which may even contradict my aim. They may lack all harmony with my conscious objective, hence also for me any feeling of direction, although by an act of active apperception I may subsequently come to a recognition of their directedness. Active thinking would correspond therefore with my idea of directed thinking. Passive thinking was inadequately characterized in my previous work as fantasying. Today I would term it intuitive thinking. To my mind, a simple stringing together of representations, such as is described by certain psychologists as associative thinking, is not thinking at all, but mere presentation. The term thinking should, in my view, be confined to the linking up of representations by means of a concept, where, in other words, an act of judgment prevails, whether such act be the product of one's intention or not. The faculty of directed thinking I term intellect. The faculty of passive or undirected thinking I term intellectual intuition. Furthermore, I describe directed thinking or intellect as the rational function, since it arranges the representations under concepts in accordance with the presuppositions of my conscious rational norm. Undirected thinking, or intellectual intuition, on the contrary, is in my view an irrational function, since it criticizes and arranges the representations according to norms that are unconscious to me and consequently not appreciated as reasonable. In certain cases, however, I may recognize subsequently that the intuitive act of judgment also corresponds with reason, although it has come about in a way that appears to me irrational. Thinking that is regulated by feeling I do not regard as intuitive thinking, but as thought dependent upon feeling. It does not follow its own logical principle, but is subordinated to the principle of feeling. In such thinking, the laws of logic are only ostensibly present. In reality, they are suspended in favor of the aims of feeling. 54. Transcendent function. See symbol. 55. Type. A type is a specimen or example which reproduces in a characteristic way the character of a species or general class. In the narrower meaning used in this particular work, a type is a characteristic model of a general attitude, occurring in many individual forms. From a great number of existing or possible attitudes, I have, in this particular research, brought 4 into especial relief, namely those that are primarily orientated by the 4 basic psychological functions, see function, namely thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. Insofar as such an attitude is habitual, thus lending a certain stamp to the character of the individual, I speak of a psychological type. These types, which are based upon the root functions and which one can term the thinking, the feeling, the intuitive, and the sensational types, may be divided into 2 classes according to the quality of the respective basic function, namely the rational and the irrational. The thinking and the feeling types belong to the former, the intuitive and the sensational to the latter, see rational, irrational. A further differentiation into 2 classes is permitted by the preferential movements of the libido, namely introversion and extraversion. All the basic types can belong equally well to the one or the other class, according to the predominance of introversion or extraversion in the general attitude. A thinking type may belong either to the introverted or the extroverted class, and the same holds good for any other type. The differentiation into rational and irrational types is another point of view, and has nothing to do with introversion and extraversion. In 2 previous contributions upon the theory of types, I did not differentiate the thinking and feeling from the introverted and extroverted types, but identified the thinking type with the introverted and the feeling with the extroverted. But a more complete investigation of the material has shown me that we must treat the introversion and the extroversion types as superordinated categories to the function types. Such a division, moreover, entirely corresponds with experience, since, for example, there are undoubtedly 2 sorts of feeling types, the attitude of one being orientated more by his feeling experience, the other more by the object. 56. Unconscious. The concept of the unconscious is for me an exclusively psychological concept, and not a philosophical concept in the metaphysical sense. In my view, the unconscious is a psychological boundary concept, which covers all those psychic contents or processes which are not conscious, that is, not related to the ego in a perceptible way. My justification for speaking of the existence of unconscious processes at all is derived purely and solely from experience, and in particular from psychopathological experience, where we have undoubted proof that in a case of hysterical amnesia, for instance, the ego knows nothing of the existence of extensive psychological complexes, and in the next moment, a simple hypnotic procedure is enough to bring the lost contents to complete reproduction. From thousands of such experiences, we may claim a certain justification for speaking of the existence of unconscious psychic contents. The question as to the state in which an unconscious content exists, when not attached to consciousness, is withheld from every possibility of cognition. It is therefore quite superfluous to hazard conjectures about it. Conjectures concerning cerebration and the whole physiological process, etc., really belong to such fantasies. It is also quite impossible to specify the range of the unconscious, that is, what contents it embraces. Only experience can decide such questions. We know by experience that conscious contents can become unconscious through loss of their energic value. This is the normal process of forgetting. That these contents do not simply get lost beneath the threshold of consciousness we know from the experience that occasionally, under suitable conditions, they can again emerge from their submersion after a decade or so, for example in dreams or under hypnosis in the form of cryptamnesia, or through the revival of associations with the forgotten content. Furthermore, experience teaches us that conscious contents can fall beneath the threshold of consciousness through intentional forgetting, without a too considerable depreciation of value, what Freud terms the repression of a painful content. A similar effect is produced by the dissociation of the personality, or the disintegration of consciousness as a result of a violent affect or nervous shock, or through the dissolution of the personality in schizophrenia, Bleuler. Similarly, we know from experience that sense perceptions, which either because of their slight intensity or because of the deviation of attention, do not attain to conscious apperception, nonetheless become psychic contents through unconscious apperception, which again may be demonstrated by hypnosis, for example. The same thing may happen with certain conclusions and other combinations which remain unconscious on account of their too slight energy content, or because of the deflection of attention. Finally, experience also teaches us that there exist unconscious psychic associations, for instance, mythological images, which have never been the object of consciousness, and hence must proceed wholly from unconscious activity. To this extent, experience gives us certain directing points for our assumption of the existence of unconscious contents. But it can affirm nothing as to what the unconscious content may possibly be. It is idle to hazard guesses about it, because what the whole unconscious content could be is quite incalculable. What is the furthest limit of a subliminal sense perception? Is there any sort of measurement, either for the extent or the subtlety of unconscious combinations? When is a forgotten content totally effaced? To such questions there is no answer. Our experience hitherto of the nature of unconscious contents permits us, however, to make a certain general division of them. We can distinguish a personal unconscious, which embraces all the acquisitions of the personal existence, hence the forgotten, the repressed, the subliminally perceived, thought and felt. But in addition to these personal unconscious contents, there exist other contents which do not originate in personal acquisitions, but in the inherited possibility of psychic functioning in general, namely in the inherited brain structure. These are the mythological associations, those motives and images which can spring anew in every age and clime, without historical tradition or migration. I term these contents the collective unconscious. Just as conscious contents are engaged in a definite activity, the unconscious contents, so experience teaches us, are similarly active. Just as certain results or products proceed from conscious psychic activity, there are also products of unconscious activity, as for instance dreams and fantasies. It is vain to speculate upon the share that consciousness takes in dreams. A dream presents itself to us. We do not consciously produce it. Conscious reproduction, or even the perception of it, certainly effects a considerable alteration in it, without, however, doing away with the basic fact of the unconscious source of the productive activity. The functional relation of the unconscious processes to consciousness we may describe as compensatory, since experience proves that the unconscious process pushes subliminal material to the surface that is constellated by the conscious situation. Hence all those contents which could not be lacking in the picture of the conscious situation if everything were conscious. The compensatory function of the unconscious becomes all the more manifest the more the conscious attitude maintains a one-sided standpoint. This is confirmed by abundant examples in the realm of pathology. 57. Will. I regard as will that sum of psychic energy which is disposable to consciousness. In accordance with this conception, the process of the will would be an energic process that is released by conscious motivation. A psychic process, therefore, which is conditioned by unconscious motivation, I would not include under the concept of the will. Will is a psychological phenomenon that owes its existence to culture and moral education, and is therefore largely lacking in the primitive mentality.